That night, he only wanted one thing, to get home in time to light his daughter's birthday candles. Instead, he climbed down into a rain-flooded ravine, smashed a car window with his bare hands, and dragged a stranger out of a burning wreck, 3 seconds before it exploded. He didn't know her name. He didn't wait for a thank you. He just climbed back up that muddy hillside, soaking wet and bleeding from both palms, and drove home to a 7-year-old girl who had fallen asleep waiting for him on the couch. That man's name was Liam Parker. And that one decision, made in the dark, in the rain, with nothing to gain, was about to cost him everything he had left. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because what happens next is something you won't see coming. The alarm went off at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Liam Parker didn't groan, didn't slam the snooze button. He just lay there for a moment in the dark of his bedroom, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been spreading slowly since February and that he still hadn't had the money to fix. He'd gotten maybe 4 hours of sleep. His lower back ached from the previous day's double shift, 8 hours under cars at Darrow's Auto and Repair, followed by a 4-hour delivery route for Crestline Logistics that had stretched to nearly 6 because 2 addresses were wrong and dispatch hadn't picked up the phone. He was 32 years old, and he felt 55. He sat up slowly, the mattress springs complaining under him, and rubbed his face with both hands. On the nightstand beside him, half hidden beneath an overdue electric bill and a receipt from the pharmacy, was a small photograph in a cracked plastic frame. His daughter, Sophie. She was 3 in the picture, missing her 2 front teeth, holding up a dandelion with the kind of absolute pride that only a 3-year-old can manage. She was 7 now. The dandelions were long gone, but the pride remained. "Okay," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "Let's go." The house they lived in was a rental, a small 2-bedroom on Callaway Street in the outer edge of Mill Haven, Tennessee, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their Christmas lights up until March, not out of laziness, but because they just had too many other things to deal with. The rent was $870 a month, not cheap by Mill Haven standards. But the landlord, Mr. Pietrovich, was a retired schoolteacher who'd known Liam's mother and who had, on 2 separate occasions over the past year, accepted payment a week and a half late without saying a word about it. That kindness was not something Liam took for granted. He patted down the narrow hallway in his socks, careful to step over the spot near Sophie's door where the floorboard creaked. He cracked her door open just enough to look in. She was burrowed under her comforter, only the top of her dark hair visible, her stuffed rabbit, named with devastating seriousness, Mr. Flops, tucked under her arm. Tomorrow was her birthday. He held the thought in his chest for a moment, the way you hold something fragile. She was turning 7, and she'd asked for one thing, a birthday cake with purple frosting from the bakery on Elm Street that she'd seen through the window twice but never been inside. Not a toy, not a phone or a tablet. A cake with purple frosting and dinner at home, and her dad present and not on his phone or exhausted and falling asleep at the table. He'd already put the cake deposit down, $23 from the envelope he kept in the kitchen drawer. He'd already requested the evening off from the delivery route. He'd told her he'd be home by 6. She'd nodded very seriously, the way she did when something mattered, and said, "Promise, Daddy, not a 6:15 promise, a real 6 promise." He'd laughed. A real 6 promise. He pulled her door almost closed and went to make coffee. Darrow's Auto and Repair opened at 7, but Liam was there at 6:30. He'd been doing that for 2 years, arriving early, staying late, doing the jobs nobody else wanted to touch. Diagnostics on vehicles that came in with no paperwork and no history. Transmission rebuilds that took all day. Oil changes on company fleet trucks that reeked of cigarettes and fast food. He wasn't the fastest mechanic on the floor. He wasn't the most technically sophisticated. But he showed up, he didn't cut corners, and he didn't fake his work orders, which, at Darrow's, apparently made him unusual. The shop was owned by a man named Gerald Fitch, mid-50s, thick around the middle, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from having never once been held accountable for anything. Gerald wasn't there most mornings. He showed up around 10, walked through the floor with a coffee cup and a clipboard, made comments that were either condescending or irrelevant, and then retreated to his office to make phone calls. He had a framed photo of himself shaking hands with the county commissioner on the wall behind his desk. He referenced it more than once in conversation. The mechanics on the floor were mostly okay. Guys who kept their heads down and did their work. Marcus Webb, who was 43 and had been there 11 years and knew more about engines than any man Liam had ever met. Danny Cho, who was 26 and talked too much but worked hard. Old Pete, who was 3 years from retirement and moved with the deliberate patience of someone who had survived everything and planned to survive the rest. Liam changed into his coveralls, poured a coffee from the break room machine that produced something closer to brown water than actual coffee, and pulled the work orders for the day. 3 oil changes, a brake job, a coolant flush, and a full diagnostic on a 2018 Jeep Cherokee that had come in with a check engine light and a rattling noise that the previous mechanic had written up as probably nothing serious. Liam pulled the Jeep into Bay 4, plugged in the diagnostic tool, and spent 20 minutes reading the codes. It wasn't nothing serious. The vehicle had a cracked exhaust manifold that was leaking directly into the cabin. Carbon monoxide. Low levels, maybe, but consistent. The customer was a woman who had told the intake desk she drove her 2 kids to school every morning, 40 minutes each way. He set down the diagnostic tablet and went to find Marcus. "You see this Jeep?" he said. Marcus looked at the printout. His jaw tightened. "Who wrote up the initial assessment?" "Fitch's nephew, the kid who was here for 2 weeks last month." "Of course." Marcus handed the tablet back. "You need to flag it." "I'm going to flag it." "Fitch isn't going to be happy." "I'm going to flag it anyway." Awesome. He flagged it. He wrote a full report, documented the codes, took photographs of the manifold crack, and submitted everything through the official work order system. Then he called the customer himself. The woman's name was Patricia Holloway, and told her clearly and calmly that her vehicle had an issue that needed to be addressed before she drove it again, particularly with children in the car. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The other mechanic told me it was fine." "I know," Liam said. "I'm sorry you were told that. It wasn't accurate." "How long will the repair take?" 2 days if we get the part in tomorrow. I'll put a rush on it." "Okay." Another pause. "Thank you for calling me." "Of course." He hung up and returned to the bay. He had the brake job to get through before lunch and 3 oil changes after. He didn't think much more about the Jeep. He'd done the right thing. That was just what you did. He didn't know yet that doing the right thing was about to be turned against him. The trouble with Crestline Logistics started not on the night of Sophie's birthday, but 3 months before it. Crestline ran a regional delivery operation out of a distribution hub on the south side of Millhaven. They contracted with a handful of local businesses, some light commercial freight, and a pharmacy network that required temperature-sensitive medication deliveries. The routes were assigned the night before. The vehicles were supposed to be inspected before every shift, and drivers were technically required to document their vehicle condition using the company app before departing. Technically. In practice, the inspection process had become a joke. Drivers would open the app, tap through the checkboxes without leaving the driver's seat, and mark everything as acceptable. The vehicles hadn't been properly serviced in months. Liam had noted a brake fluid issue on truck 14 in November and submitted it through the app. Nothing happened. He noted it again 2 weeks later. Still nothing. In December, he'd gone directly to the shift supervisor, a man named Carl Briggs, who had the energy of someone who had given up on things long before anyone had asked him to, and said it plainly. "Truck 14 has a brake problem. It shouldn't be on the road." Carl had looked at him with that particular kind of tiredness. "Put it in the app." "I put it in the app twice." "Then it's logged. We'll get to it." "When?" Carl had turned back to his computer. "When we get to it, Parker." Liam had driven truck 14 that night because he needed the hours and there was no other vehicle available. He'd driven it carefully, avoided the highway, and turned it in the moment the route was done. The next day it was back in rotation. He'd made a formal written complaint in January. He'd documented everything. The brake issue, the falsified inspection records, a tire blowout on Route 7 that had been written off as driver error rather than addressed as a maintenance failure. He'd submitted the complaint to Crestline's regional office. He hadn't heard anything back. He hadn't expected to. but he'd also made a copy and kept it. The evening of Sophie's birthday started well. Liam finished his shift at Darrow's at 3:30, picked up the cake from the bakery on Elm Street. The woman behind the counter had done the purple frosting in small rosettes along the edge, more beautiful than he'd expected, and stopped at the grocery store for the ingredients to make Sophie's other request. Spaghetti with meatballs, like the cartoon, which he understood to mean Lady and the Tramp, and which he had absolutely no problem with. He picked Sophie up from the after-school program at 4:15. She ran to him across the gymnasium floor the way she still did, without self-consciousness, full sprint, backpack bouncing, and slammed into him hard enough that he had to take a step back. "Daddy." "Hey, birthday girl." She pulled back and looked at him with an expression of devastating suspicion. "You smell like the car place." I showered. "You still smell like it a little." "I'll shower again when we get home." She seemed to accept this. "Is there cake?" "There's cake." "Purple?" "Extremely purple." She took his hand and they walked to the truck. The call from Crestline came at 5:20. He was standing in the kitchen, browning meatballs, Sophie doing homework at the table behind him, when his phone rang. The number was Carl Briggs. He almost didn't answer. He had the evening off. He'd requested it weeks ago. It was approved. But the job paid $17.40 an hour, and he needed every hour he could get. And some part of him, the part that had been running scared for 3 years, answered the phone anyway. "Parker." Carl's voice was flat. "We're short tonight." Perkins called out. "I need you on Route 11. "Carl, I have the night off. I requested it 6 weeks ago. Sophie's birthday." I know. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't in a bind. It's a 3-hour route, maximum. You'd be done by 9. He looked at Sophie. She was chewing on the end of her pencil, working through a math worksheet, not looking up. 3 hours? 3 hours, maybe less. Route 11 is the pharmacy run. It's clean, easy, you know it. He squeezed the counter. "I'll do 2 hours. I'll do the first half of the route and hand it off." "There's no one to hand it off to." "Then I'll do the route, Carl, but I need to be back by 9. That's the deal. If it goes past 9, you pull the route." Fine. 9 o'clock. "Thank you, Parker. You're saving me here." He hung up and stared at the wall for a moment. Then he finished the meatballs. He made Sophie's dinner. They ate together, the two of them, at the kitchen table, and he told her he had to go do one more thing for work, but that he'd be back before her bedtime, definitely before 9, and they'd have cake and sing, and it would be a real birthday. She looked at him for a long moment, the look of a child who has learned how to manage disappointment. "Okay," she said. "Don't forget the candles." 7 candles, I know. "Promise?" "Real 6 promise," he said. "Except for 9. That got a small smile. It was the best he could do. He kissed the top of her head, told Mrs. Garza next door to check in, and drove to the Crestline hub. Route 11 ran north out of Millhaven along State Route 9, through a stretch of forested hill country before dropping back into the valley. It was 63 miles of road that Liam had driven 100 times. In good weather, it was one of the more pleasant routes in rotation, winding through pine and hardwood, the occasional deer standing roadside, the valley lights visible from the high ridge. In a storm, it was something else entirely. The rain had started around 6, and by 8 it was coming down in sheets, the kind of rain that made your headlights useless past 40 feet and turned drainage ditches into running rivers. The wind off the ridge hit the truck in gusts that pushed the steering wheel in his hands. He slowed to 40, then 35, the wiper blades slapping uselessly against the downpour. He was on the final stretch before the drop back into the valley. He'd made all 4 pharmacy stops. The cargo compartment was empty. He was maybe 25 minutes from home. Enough time, barely, for cake and candles. He was thinking about the candles when he saw the headlights. They came from the southbound lane, moving fast. Too fast for these conditions, too fast for a road with no guardrail on the mountainside, and then, without any skid, without any apparent correction, as if the driver had simply ceased to exist, the car crossed the center line and went over the edge. Liam hit his brakes before his brain had fully processed what he'd seen. He pulled the truck to the shoulder, hazard lights on, and sat there for 1 second, just one, looking at the place where the car had disappeared. There was a gap in the tree line, rain hammering the windshield, silence where there had been headlights. He got out of the truck. The ravine was steeper than it looked from the road. The car, a dark luxury sedan, the kind with a low front end and tinted windows, had gone through a stand of young birch trees and come to rest against a granite outcrop about 40 feet below the road. One of the headlights was still on, cutting uselessly into the darkness. Smoke was rising from the hood. The front end had folded accordion style. Liam went down the slope on his hands and feet, sliding more than climbing, the wet clay coming away in chunks under his boots. A branch caught his forearm, and he felt the skin open. He kept moving. The driver's side window was shattered but not completely broken. He could see a figure inside, female, dark hair, slumped against the deployed airbag. He reached the car and grabbed the door handle, locked. The frame had warped. The door wasn't going to open regardless. He pulled off his jacket, wrapped it around his elbow, and drove it into the remaining glass. It took 2 hits. Then he reached in and unlocked the door from inside and pulled. The warped frame made it impossible with one hand. He planted his foot against the body of the car and yanked with both hands, using his entire body weight, and the door shrieked open on bent hinges. The woman was conscious. Barely. She had a cut across her forehead that was bleeding heavily into her left eye. Her right hand was pressed against the center console at an angle that suggested the wrist was broken. She was wearing a silk blouse that was now soaked in blood and rain, and she was looking at him with the particular focus of someone trying very hard to stay awake. "I've got you," he said. Not a question, not a reassurance exactly, just a statement of fact. "I need you to help me as much as you can." "Can you move your left arm?" She moved it, slowly, but she moved it. "Good. Put it around my neck. Don't worry about the right hand." There's someone," she started. "Is there someone else in the car?" She blinked, seemed to recalibrate. "No, I'm alone." "Okay. Put your arm around my neck." She did. He got his arms under her, one behind her back, one under her knees, and he lifted. She made a sound that he tried not to think about. He was not a large man. He was 5'11" and lean, built by years of labor rather than any deliberate effort. And she was a full-grown adult, and he was standing on wet clay on a 45-degree slope in the dark. He went up the slope the same way he'd come down, except now he was carrying her and he couldn't use his hands. He moved diagonally, found footholds where he could, pressed his shoulder into the hillside when he slipped, kept moving. His arms burned, his boots filled with mud. Somewhere in the middle of it, she lost consciousness. He felt her weight shift and go fully dead. And he adjusted his grip and kept climbing. He was almost to the road when the car below them ignited. Not an explosion, not like in the movies. It was a heavy, concussive thump, and then orange light flooded up the hillside and heat rolled across the back of his neck, and he turned his face away and took the last 10 feet at something close to a run. He reached the road surface and laid her down on the shoulder, as far from the edge as he could manage, and knelt beside her. She was breathing. Her pulse, when he pressed 2 fingers to her throat, was present. Fast, irregular, but present. He looked back at the ravine. The car was fully burning now, the rain doing nothing against it, orange and black smoke rising into the sky. The birch trees around it were catching. He could see, even from here, that the vehicle he'd pulled her from no longer existed as a thing a person could survive. He was aware, distantly, that his hands were shaking. He was aware that he was bleeding from his forearm and his knee, and possibly somewhere on his head, because something warm was tracking down behind his left ear. He was aware that it was 8:47, and he was not going to make it home by 9. He pulled out his phone and called 911, gave them the location, described the victim's condition, confirmed the car fire. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line. He stayed on the line. He sat next to the woman on the wet asphalt in the dark, emergency lights pulsing orange behind him, rain pouring down on both of them, and talked to the dispatcher until he could hear the sirens starting up from somewhere in the valley below. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later, which is fast for a mountain road in a rainstorm. They took one look at the woman, the head wound, the likely concussion, the broken wrist, the possibility of spinal involvement, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 100 times and knew every second mattered. They asked Liam 2 questions. Was she alone in the vehicle, and had she lost consciousness? He answered both. Then one of the paramedics looked at him and said, "You should come with us, sir. That arm needs attention." "I'm fine." The paramedic, she was maybe 28, with a calm that Liam found genuinely impressive, looked at his forearm without touching it. "You've got a laceration that probably needs stitches. I'll get it looked at." "Sir, I have to get home." He heard himself say it and recognized how it sounded, but also didn't have a better answer for the feeling that had been sitting in his chest since 8:47. "My daughter is waiting." The paramedic held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded, just once, the kind of nod that accepts a thing without endorsing it. "Put pressure on it," she said, and handed him a folded gauze pad from her kit. "Thank you." He watched them load the woman into the ambulance, watched the ambulance doors close, watched it pull away south toward Millhaven General, lights going, sirens starting up again. He stood there in the rain for a moment longer, listening to it fade. Then he wrapped the gauze around his arm, got back in the truck, and drove home. Sophie was asleep on the couch. She'd made an effort, that was clear. She'd put on her birthday dress, the yellow one that her grandmother had sent, that she saved for important occasions, and she'd set 2 plates at the coffee table, with napkins folded into rough triangles. The cake was in the center of the table, the candles already inserted, a box of matches placed neatly beside it. Mr. Flops was propped up in the corner of the couch like an invited guest. She'd fallen asleep sitting up, her head tipped sideways against the armrest, still in the yellow dress, still wearing the plastic birthday crown from the dollar store that Liam had picked up 2 weeks ago and hidden in his sock drawer. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He set the truck keys down quietly on the hook by the door. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the coffee table, across from his sleeping daughter, and he looked at her. The birthday crown, the folded napkins, the matches placed just so, ready for him. He was wet and dirty and bleeding through the gauze on his arm, and he smelled like smoke and mud, and he was the most devastated he had been in a very long time. He didn't wake her. He thought about it. He picked up the matches and thought about lighting the candles anyway, singing quietly, waking her to something. But it was nearly 10:30, and she had school in the morning, and some part of him knew that this was a thing he would not be able to fix tonight. Instead, he got a blanket from the closet and tucked it over her carefully, over the yellow dress, around Mr. Flops. He took the matches back to the sock drawer. Then he went to the bathroom and cleaned his arm over the sink, watching the pink water run down the drain, and he let himself feel, very quietly and very privately, the full weight of what this particular day had cost him. Outside, the rain continued. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did. But the next morning he was up before the alarm, standing in the kitchen in gray light, coffee going, when he heard Sophie's footsteps in the hallway. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in the birthday dress, hair on one side of her face from the pillow. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "You came home." "I came home. Late. Late. Yeah." He crouched down to be level with her. "I'm sorry, Soph. Something happened on the road last night. Someone needed help." She studied his arm. He'd wrapped it properly, the gauze visible under his sleeve. Her eyes moved to it and then back to his face. "Did you help them?" "Yeah." She thought about this. "Are they okay?" "I think so, yeah." Another pause. The coffee maker finished its cycle and beeped twice. "Can we have cake for breakfast?" Sophie said. He almost laughed. He felt it rise up in him from somewhere deep. "We can have cake for breakfast." "With the candles?" "With all 7 candles." She nodded, satisfied with this arrangement. "I'll get the matches." He watched her go to the sock drawer. She knew exactly where he'd put them. And he thought, this kid is going to be okay. More than okay. He pulled the cake out of the refrigerator and set it on the table, and he lit the candles. And Sophie stood in front of them in her birthday dress with her hair sideways from sleep, and she blew them out on the first try, and she made a wish that she would not share with him, no matter how he asked. He didn't press her. Some things a person is entitled to keep. He was still smiling about it when his phone rang at 8:15. The number was the main line for Crestline Logistics. He answered it. The voice on the other end was not Carl Briggs. It was a woman he'd never spoken to, from what she identified as the Regional Operations Office. And she told him, in the flat and practiced tone of someone who had done this before, that his employment with Crestline Logistics was being terminated, effective immediately, for abandonment of route and failure to complete assigned delivery obligations. Liam sat very still at the kitchen table. "I completed the route," he said. "I made all 4 pharmacy deliveries. I have timestamps. You abandoned your vehicle on State Route 9 for a period of over 40 minutes, Mr. Parker. That's considered route abandonment under your employment agreement. There was an accident. I called 911. A woman's car went into the ravine. I pulled her out before the vehicle. That's not something that's been reported to us. I reported it to 911. There will be a record. Check the incident report for State Route 9 last night around 8:40 p.m. It'll be there." A pause. The pause of someone who has already made a decision. "Your final paycheck will be processed within the standard timeline of 14 business days. Per your employment agreement, you forfeit any outstanding bonus accrual." 14 days? His voice came out harder than he intended. "I have bills. I have a daughter." "That's the standard timeline, Mr. Parker. You'll receive the official termination notice by email. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She hung up. He put the phone down on the table and looked at it for a long time. Sophie was in the other room, brushing her teeth. He could hear the water running, could hear her humming something to herself. Some song from school, probably. Some earworm that she'd been carrying around for a week. He picked up the phone again and called Darrow's to let them know he'd be in for his regular shift. Gerald Fitch answered, which was unusual. "Parker?" His voice had a quality to it that Liam recognized immediately, the way you recognize a smell, carefully neutral, prepared. "I was about to call you." Liam felt something cold move through him. "Gerald, we had a meeting yesterday afternoon with the shop's insurance carrier. They did a review of recent service documentation and," a pause, deliberate. "There were some concerns raised about work order irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The Jeep Cherokee from last week, the one you flagged for the exhaust manifold issue. The customer's already filed a complaint, says she was told her car was fine initially, and then suddenly it wasn't. Says she felt misled. She was misled. By someone else. I'm the one who corrected it." "Parker." Gerald's voice took on the particular weight of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed. "The insurance carrier's position is that the initial assessment was within acceptable parameters, and your documentation created unnecessary liability exposure for the shop. Combined with some other concerns about your work style, I think it's best if we part ways." The cold thing spread. "You're firing me for filing an accurate safety report." "I'm restructuring the team. It's a business decision." "Gerald, you'll be paid through end of shift today. I'd appreciate it if you'd bring your tools by the shop before noon." The line went quiet. Liam set the phone down again. He looked at the birthday cake still on the table. The candle wax hardened where it had dripped down the sides, the purple frosting in its careful rosettes. In the span of 40 minutes, he had lost both of his jobs. Not because he'd done anything wrong, because he'd done everything right. He drove Sophie to school. He did not tell her. He kept his voice even and asked about her math worksheet, and she complained about fractions the whole way there, with the particular passion that only second graders can bring to mathematics. When he dropped her off, she hugged him around the neck and then ran toward the entrance without looking back, which was what she did when everything was fine. He waited until she was through the doors. Then he sat in the parking lot for a while, hands on the steering wheel, engine running. He thought about the woman he'd pulled out of the burning car, whether she'd made it through the night, whether she was sitting up in a hospital bed somewhere in Millhaven, or whether something had gone wrong after the ambulance. He hadn't asked for her name, hadn't thought to. It hadn't seemed like the point. He thought about $870 rent and Sophie's medication copays and the electric bill under the pharmacy receipt on his nightstand and the water stain on the ceiling that was still spreading. He thought about the copy of the Crestline complaint he'd kept. Then he put the truck in drive and went to get his tools. The town of Millhaven moved on through its morning as it always did. Coffee shops filling up, school buses pulling away, the machine of ordinary life grinding forward. In a hospital room on the third floor of Millhaven General, A woman named Isabella Sterling lay with her wrist in a temporary cast and 43 stitches across her forehead, staring at the ceiling and asking her assistant, for the third time, to find the man who had pulled her out of that car. She didn't know his name, but she knew he'd gone back into the rain alone, and she intended to find out why. The tools fit into 2 milk crates, which said something about 3 years of a man's working life, that it could be reduced to 2 plastic crates that stacked in the bed of a pickup truck without ceremony or difficulty. Liam made 2 trips from the shop to the parking lot. Marcus walked out with him on the second trip, carrying nothing, just walking alongside him the way a person does when they don't have the right words and know it. They stood at the truck for a moment. The morning was overcast, the rain from the previous night still sitting in the air as a heavy mist that clung to everything and made the world feel compressed and close. "Fitch is an idiot," Marcus said finally. "Yeah. That Jeep was a legitimate safety call. Anyone with eyes could see it." "I know. You want me to say something? I've got 11 years there. He listens to me sometimes." Liam looked at him. Marcus was a good man, one of the genuinely good ones, the kind who showed up and did what they said and didn't make a production out of it. "No," Liam said. "Don't put yourself in it. You've got a family." "So do you." "I'll figure it out." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he also didn't push. He stuck out his hand and Liam shook it, and that was that. The end of 3 years and 200 oil changes and 100 brake jobs, compressed into a handshake in a parking lot. Marcus went back inside. Liam got in the truck. He sat there with the engine off for a minute, doing the math he'd been avoiding since the phone calls that morning. Rent was due in 18 days. Sophie's allergy medication, the one that actually worked, the name brand one that the generic version didn't adequately replace, was $140 a month after insurance, and Crestline had been carrying his health coverage. Without it, the math got worse very fast. He had $340 in checking and a savings account with $780 in it that he thought of as the absolute floor, the thing he would not touch unless something truly broke. He turned the engine on and pulled out of the lot. There were other jobs. There were always other jobs, technically. The question was whether they paid enough, whether they'd take him without a reference from Crestline or Darrow's, whether they came with benefits. He drove toward home, running through the mental inventory of shops he knew in Mill Haven and the surrounding area. 2 were unionized, which meant a waiting period. One was owned by a cousin of Gerald Fitch, which he crossed off immediately. There was a national chain on the highway interchange that always had a help wanted sign in the window, but that paid $2 an hour less than Darrow's and had a reputation for pushing mechanics to upsell unnecessary work to customers, which was the kind of thing Liam had never been able to make himself do, no matter how much he needed the money. He pulled into the driveway on Callaway Street and sat in the truck. The house looked small in the gray morning light. The gutters were pulling away from the fascia on the left side. He'd noticed it in the fall and hadn't gotten to it. The welcome mat that Sophie had picked out, the one with the cartoon dog on it, was starting to fray at the edges. These were the things you saw when you were sitting still in your own driveway at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning with nowhere to be. He went inside and made a second pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started making a list. Not of worries, of actions. He'd learned that distinction 3 years ago, in the weeks after the funeral, when Sophie was 4 and couldn't understand why her mother wasn't coming back, and Liam couldn't understand much of anything either. A grief counselor, a short woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who had said very few things and listened very well, had told him once, "A list of worries is just suffering with bullet points. A list of actions is something else." He'd remembered it. He wrote job applications, unemployment filing, insurance alternatives, medication, call pharmacy, assistance programs, Crestline complaint, follow up. He stared at that last one for a moment. Then he underlined it. He still had the copy. The documentation he'd kept from January, the brake records, the falsified inspection logs, the written complaint he'd submitted to the regional office that had apparently gone into the void. He had it all in a manila envelope in the bottom drawer of his dresser, under a stack of Sophie's old drawings that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He hadn't done anything with it beyond keeping it, some instinct telling him to hold on to the evidence even when there was no immediate purpose for it. There was still no immediate purpose. But he was starting to feel, sitting at the kitchen table in the gray morning, that keeping silent about it had cost him more than speaking up ever would. He opened his laptop and started with the unemployment filing. The Crestline termination call had come at 8:15. By 10:40, three things had happened that Liam didn't know about yet. The first was that Patricia Holloway, the woman whose Jeep Cherokee he'd flagged for the exhaust manifold issue, had called Darrow's Auto and Repair to ask about the status of her repair, been told by the front desk that the mechanic who'd flagged it was no longer with the company, and immediately gone online to leave a 5-star review specifically naming Liam Parker as the person who had correctly identified a carbon monoxide risk that another mechanic had missed. She'd also called the Tennessee Department of Commerce's Consumer Protection Line, on general principle, because she was a woman who believed in following things through. The second was that a county road crew had reached the ravine on State Route 9 and begun the process of documenting the accident scene for an incident report. The car, what remained of it, was a 2023 Mercedes-Benz S-Class registered to a holding company called Sterling Capital Group, LLC. The incident report would eventually cross the desk of a junior insurance adjuster, who would forward it to a senior claims manager, who would contact Sterling Capital Group directly. The third was that Isabella Sterling, in room 314 of Millhaven General Hospital, had asked her assistant for the third time to find the man who had pulled her out of the car, and her assistant, a 24-year-old named Priya, who was exceptionally capable and who had learned over 2 years of working for Isabella that find out was not a suggestion, had started making calls. Isabella had not slept particularly well. This was not unusual for her. She averaged around 5.5 hours on a good night, had been that way since business school, and had long since stopped fighting it. But the previous night had been different. She'd lain in the hospital bed with her wrist elevated and the side of her face feeling like it was made of hot glass, listening to the nighttime sounds of the hospital corridor, and she'd kept returning to the same image. Hands. A man's hands coming through the broken window, large hands, work-roughened, bleeding at the knuckles, moving with complete certainty through the chaos. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for most of it. She remembered the sound of rain. She remembered being lifted, the particular shock of being moved when every part of you hurts. She remembered, at some point on the slope, the orange light that bloomed up from below and the heat that came with it, and she understood, in the way you understand things through shock and adrenaline rather than through clear thinking, how close it had been. She had not been afraid. That surprised her when she thought about it in the hospital room. She had not been afraid because there had been hands and a voice, calm, plain, not performing calm but actually calm, saying, "I've got you," and something in her had believed it completely. She wanted to know who that was. Priya found a lead by noon. "The 911 call," she said, standing in the doorway of the hospital room with her phone in her hand, the way she always stood when she had information she wasn't sure Isabella was going to like the context of. State Route 9, last night at 8:43 p.m. The caller identified himself as a Crestline logistics driver on Route 11. Priya looked down at her phone. Liam Parker, age 32, address on Callaway Street. Isabella looked at the ceiling. Crestline Logistics. Regional delivery company. About 60 employees. I know what it is. She'd seen the name before. She couldn't place it immediately, but she'd seen it. Get me everything you can on him. Not an investigator. I just want to know who he is. Work history, basic background. Priya nodded. She hesitated at the door. What? Isabella said. He didn't stay. At the scene. The paramedics noted it. The caller left before they arrived. One of the EMTs said he told them he had to get home. Isabella was quiet for a moment. He had somewhere to be. Apparently. Find out who he is, Priya. Priya found out who he was. It took her most of the afternoon, which told Isabella something in itself, that this was not a man who had any kind of public profile, no LinkedIn, no social media she could locate, no news mentions, nothing. He existed in the ordinary administrative record of a working life. Employment records, a vehicle registration, a rental agreement, a handful of public documents. He'd been married. His wife had died 3 years ago. The death record listed the cause as an aggressive form of ovarian cancer, diagnosed 8 months before her passing. He had one child, a daughter, age 7. Priya handed Isabella a printed summary at 4 in the afternoon with the careful neutrality of someone who has assembled a picture and is letting the other person draw their own conclusions. Isabella read it. Then she read it again. She set it down on the bedside table next to the plastic cup of ice chips the nurse had brought her, and she looked out the window at the Millhaven skyline, which was not much of a skyline, mostly low commercial buildings and a water tower. And she thought about a man who had stopped on a mountain road in a rainstorm to pull a stranger out of a burning car, and then gone home to light birthday candles. "Pull everything on Crestline Logistics," she said. Priya looked up from her phone. "How deep?" "All the way." There was something in Isabella's voice that Priya recognized and that always meant the same thing. Not anger exactly, but the focused, forward-leaning version of attention that preceded a decision already half made. "Okay," Priya said, and went to make the calls. Liam spent that Tuesday the way he spent most hard days, moving. He couldn't afford to sit still, not financially and not temperamentally. He filed the unemployment claim online, which took an hour and 40 minutes because the state portal kept timing out, and he had to re-enter his employer information 3 times. He called Sophie's pharmacy and asked about patient assistance programs. The pharmacist, a kind older man named Roger, who'd been there since before Sophie was born, walked him through 2 options and told him to come in Thursday with the paperwork and they'd work it out. He called a shop over in Graysville, a independent place he'd heard decent things about, and left a message for the owner. He made a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt like stopping. He picked Sophie up at 3:45. She'd had a good day, or what constituted a good day for a second grader. She'd gotten a perfect score on her spelling test, someone had brought cupcakes for a birthday, and her best friend Kezia had taught her a handshake that had 7 steps, and that Sophie demonstrated twice in the school parking lot before Liam could get her buckled in. He did not tell her about the jobs. She was 7. She would find out eventually, in the way that children find out the things their parents try to shield them from, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation, through a slightly longer wait before new shoes, through the brand of cereal changing, through the quality of the quiet in the evenings. But he was not going to tell her today. Today she had a 7-step handshake and a perfect spelling score, and that was what today was going to be. He made dinner. She did homework. She took a bath without being asked, which happened maybe twice a month and was always slightly suspicious. And then she brought him Mr. Flops and asked if he would tell her a story. He told her one about a rabbit who wanted to climb a mountain and kept getting distracted by interesting rocks along the way. Sophie fell asleep before the rabbit reached the top, which was probably the point. He sat in the chair beside her bed for longer than he needed to. Then he went to the dresser and took out the manila envelope. He sat at the kitchen table again, this time with the documents spread out in front of him. The brake records, the inspection logs with their falsified timestamps, his written complaint from January, the internal emails he'd forwarded to himself before submitting the complaint, the photographs he'd taken on his phone of the vehicle logbook discrepancies. Looking at it all laid out, it was more substantial than he'd remembered, more specific. There were names in here. Carl Briggs, the regional operations manager whose name he'd seen on internal communications, a maintenance contractor whose invoices didn't match the service records. He'd put this together in January because he believed someone with authority over Crestline would look at it and act. He'd submitted it through the proper channel and heard nothing back. Now he was unemployed, in part because he'd submitted it, and the documentation was still sitting in his kitchen in a manila envelope. He was not an impulsive person. He thought about things. He thought about this for a long time, long past midnight, the house quiet around him, Sophie's nightlight making a thin yellow line under her bedroom door. He thought, if a driver had an accident on Route 11 because of those brakes, and someone was hurt, and it came out that there had been a documented complaint that nobody acted on, that would be on him, at least in part. Not legally, maybe, but in the way that mattered to him. He thought about who he might send the documentation to. He thought about whether anyone would actually do anything with it. He thought about the ways this could go wrong, the ways that going up against a company, even a mid-sized regional one, tended to go for people without resources or connections. He went to bed without deciding anything. He would not have to wait very long for the decision to be made for him. Wednesday came in gray and cool. Liam drove the Graysville shop. The owner, a man named Ted Haskell, was there in person and walked the floor with him for 40 minutes asking questions about his experience. The conversation went well, Liam thought. Ted was direct and practical and seemed less interested in references than in whether Liam knew what he was talking about, which Liam did. Ted said he'd call by end of week. On the way home, Liam stopped at the pharmacy to sort out the assistant's paperwork with Roger. Roger had printed the forms ahead of time and walked through them patiently, and they got it handled in 20 minutes. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was enough to keep Sophie's medication accessible for the immediate future. And Liam sat in the truck afterward and allowed himself to feel, briefly, the specific relief of a problem being smaller than it was yesterday. His phone rang. Unknown number, Tennessee area code. He answered it out of the particular habit of a man who could not afford to miss calls. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, and introduced herself as an investigative journalist from the Millhaven Courier. Her name was Dana Rourke. She said she'd received a tip about safety violations at a regional logistics company and that his name had come up as a former employee who had filed a complaint. Liam was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you get my name?" "I'd rather not say at this stage, but I want to be transparent. I'm working on a story. I'm not looking to misrepresent anything. I'd like to hear your experience directly." "What kind of story?" "The kind where a company's been falsifying maintenance records and nothing happens until something bad does." A brief pause. "I've already got documentation from another source. I'm trying to corroborate it." He looked through the windshield at the pharmacy parking lot. A woman was loading grocery bags into a minivan 2 spaces over, her toddler standing in the cart, hands on the cart bar, watching everything with the absolute focus of someone encountering the world for the first time. "I have documentation too," Liam said. Dana Rourke was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Could we meet?" They met Thursday morning at a coffee shop on Milner Avenue, which was neither near the pharmacy nor near Crestline, which Liam appreciated without saying. Dana was in her late 30s, with the slightly compressed energy of someone who ran on deadlines and took notes even in casual conversation. She was already at the table when he arrived, coffee in front of her, a legal pad open. He put the manila envelope on the table. She looked at it the way that people look at things they've been hoping to find. "Can I?" "Yeah." She went through it methodically, page by page, her expression neutral in the professional way of someone trained not to telegraph reaction. She paused twice, once at the vehicle logbook discrepancies, once at the forwarded internal emails, and made notes both times. "This is your original complaint submitted in January," she said. "January 14th. I have the submission confirmation email on my phone. And you never received any response." "Nothing." She set down the last page. "You were fired Tuesday morning, 8:15. 2 days after they confirmed you'd been the 911 caller on Route 9. He looked at her. "How do you know about Route 9? "The incident report is public record." She met his eyes. "Mr. Parker, I want to be straight with you. What you have here, combined with what I already have, that's a story, a real one. But I also want you to understand what going on record means. Crestline's going to push back. They may dispute the records. They may try to paint you as a disgruntled employee. I know. And your name will be attached to it. I know that too." He picked up his coffee. It was too hot, but he drank it anyway. "My name's already attached to a complaint they ignored. I figure if they're going to use it against me, I might as well have something to show for it." Dana Rourke wrote something on her legal pad. Then she said, "I'm also curious about the accident. The woman you pulled out of the car." "What about her? Do you know who she is?" "No." Dana looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of someone sitting with information they haven't decided to share yet. "She's Isabella Sterling," she said. "Sterling Capital Group." The name meant something, not personally. He'd never met her, never had reason to. But the company name had passed through his awareness the way certain local names do when you live in a place long enough. Sterling Capital was one of the larger investment entities in the region. They owned pieces of several businesses in Millhaven. He wasn't sure what pieces. "Okay," he said. "She's been asking about you, from the hospital." He put his coffee down. "How do you know that?" "Because I asked the right people." She said it without apology. I don't think she's connected to Crestline in any way, but I thought you should know she's looking. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is she okay? Dana blinked, as if that wasn't the response she'd expected. She's going to be fine. Concussion, broken wrist, some lacerations. She'll be discharged tomorrow, I think. Okay, he said again. He thought about it for the rest of Thursday, not with any expectation. He wasn't constructing some narrative where this became something it wasn't. He thought about it the way you think about a strange coincidence, the way two separate things you're carrying happen to be connected in a way you didn't plan. He thought about her voice in the car, the way she'd said there's someone before she understood she was alone. The instinct, even through the concussion and the shock, to make sure everyone was accounted for. He didn't know what kind of person Isabella Sterling was. He knew that she'd been alone on that mountain road in a rainstorm, and that she'd stayed conscious long enough to ask the right questions. That was all he knew. It wasn't nothing. Friday came and went. Ted Haskell from the Graysville shop called at 4 p.m. and said he'd like to bring Liam on starting the following Monday, $19.50 an hour, no benefits for the first 60 days, but full coverage after that. Liam said yes before the man finished the sentence, and then felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He told Sophie over dinner. She thought about it carefully, the way she processed most things, and then said, "Is it far?" "About 20 minutes." "Do they have a break room?" "I think so. Why?" "Because at Darrow's you always came home smelling like that bad coffee." He laughed for real this time, the full kind that catches you off guard. "I'll find out about the coffee." "Good." She returned to her pasta. "I think you should get a job with better coffee." That night, after she was asleep, he sat on the porch with the last of a six-pack he'd been making last for 2 weeks and listened to the neighborhood settle into quiet, the distant sound of a TV through an open window, a dog somewhere on the next block, the occasional car. The sky had cleared and the stars were out, not dramatic, just present the way they always are when you remember to look. The Dana Rourke article ran the following Tuesday. It ran on the Courier's website at 7 a.m. and in print the same afternoon. The headline was careful: safety records, terminated employee, and questions about Crestline logistics. But the content was not careful at all. It was specific and documented: falsified inspection logs, a pattern of retaliation against employees who filed complaints, the brake record discrepancies, the January complaint that had gone unanswered, and the account of a driver who had been fired the morning after a 911 call made while completing his route. Dana had not named the accident victim. She had named Liam. By noon, the Courier article had been shared across 3 regional news outlets. By 2 in the afternoon, a television news crew from the Nashville affiliate was parked outside the Crestline hub on the south side of Millhaven. Liam found out about all of this from Marcus, who texted him a link at 12:30 with the message, "They put your name in it." And then, 5 minutes later, good. He read the article in the parking lot of the Graysville shop on his lunch break, his first week on the new job. It was strange to see himself in print. Strange to see the documentation he'd kept in a manila envelope in his dresser rendered into clean journalistic sentences. He read it twice, feeling something he couldn't cleanly name. Not vindication exactly, because the thing that had been done wrong had already been done, and a newspaper article didn't undo any of it. Closer to the feeling of no longer being the only person in the room who knew something true. He put his phone in his pocket and went back inside. What he didn't know, sitting in that parking lot in Graysville, was that the article had also been read, in its entirety, twice, with a yellow legal pad open beside her, by Isabella Sterling. She was home from the hospital by then. Her wrist was in a proper cast, white with a fiberglass shell, and her assistant Priya had set up a home office arrangement so that she could work without coming into Sterling Capital's downtown offices, which Isabella found simultaneously practical and slightly suffocating. She was not good at being still. She had never been good at it. She read the article. She read the name Liam Parker, which she now knew was the name of the man with the work-roughened hands. She read about a safety complaint filed in January that had gone nowhere. She read about falsified records and a pattern of retaliation. She read that he'd been fired on the morning after the rescue, fired for abandoning his route, which the article made clear he had not done, which the documentation made clear, which the 911 timestamp made clear. She set down the legal pad. "Priya," she said. Priya appeared in the doorway. She'd been working from the kitchen table, close enough to hear without hovering, which was the arrangement they'd developed over 2 years. "Get me everything on Crestline Logistics, not the background summary. Everything. Financials, ownership structure, existing litigation, service contracts." Isabella looked up. "And find out who holds their primary debt." Priya's pen stopped moving on her notepad. "Are you thinking about acquiring them?" "I'm thinking about knowing everything first," Isabella said. "Then I'll think about acquiring them." This was how Isabella Sterling worked. She did not make impulsive decisions. She made very fast ones, but they were built on information, on the kind of thorough preparation that other people sometimes mistook for caution. She'd built Sterling Capital from a single regional real estate holding into a diversified investment firm with interests across logistics, commercial property, and mid-market manufacturing. She was 30 years old, and she was good at this, not because she was smarter than everyone around her, but because she paid more attention, and she did not look away from things that were unpleasant to see. What she was seeing in the Courier article, and in the Crestline financial documents that Priya would have on her desk within 48 hours, was a company that had been cutting corners in ways that had very nearly killed one of its own employees, and that had used its institutional weight to silence the people who pointed it out. She had seen this kind of thing before. She had a particular reaction to it, one she'd developed young and never managed to reason herself out of. She did not like watching people get crushed for being honest. She'd been crushed a few times herself, early in her career, in ways that the professional world tends to normalize, to dismissed in meetings, talked over, her projections questioned by men who hadn't looked at them. She'd built around it, moved past it, done what needed to be done. But she hadn't forgotten the specific feeling of being right about something and being made smaller for it. She thought about Liam Parker in the parking lot of Darrow's Auto and Repair with 2 milk crates of tools. She hadn't seen it. She'd never met him, didn't know his face. But she could construct it clearly enough from everything she now knew. The timing, the sequence. He'd filed a complaint about safety violations. He'd been fired, and the firing had been framed as a business decision. He'd stopped to pull her out of a burning car on his way home to his daughter's birthday party. He'd been fired the next morning. She picked up her pen. The investigation she was about to authorize would take less than 2 weeks. It would surface things that the Courier article hadn't found, because Dana Rourke was working with public records and source testimony, and Priya had access to things that required a different kind of phone call. What they would find in the internal operations of Crestline Logistics was worse than the article had suggested. Not dramatically worse, in the movie villain sense. Just steadily, documentably, systematically worse, in the way that institutional negligence tends to be. Not one person making one evil decision, but a structure that had been set up to reward looking the other way and punish anything that interrupted the flow of revenue, sustained over years, affecting dozens of people who had needed the jobs too much to risk their positions by making noise. Isabella Sterling made a list, not of worries, she wasn't that kind of person, of actions. And in his small house on Calloway Street, after his second day at the Graysville shop, Liam Parker helped Sophie with her fractions homework, got the math wrong on the first try, got corrected by his 7-year-old with enormous dignity, and got it right on the second. He made soup from what was in the refrigerator. Not impressive soup, but functional soup, the kind that exists to solve the problem of dinner. Sophie declared it pretty good, not amazing, which he accepted as a reasonable review. He didn't know that someone he'd never met was sitting in a house across town with a legal pad, a cast on a wrist, and his name at the top of a list. He didn't know what was coming. He was just trying to get through the week. Priya delivered the Crestline file on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Isabella had asked for it. She set it on the kitchen table, now functioning as Isabella's primary workspace, the downtown office still feeling like too much, the cast on her wrist making the commute more effort than it was worth, and stood back the way she did when something was heavier than expected. The file was thick, not metaphorically, physically thick, the kind of folder that bends at the spine when you open it flat. "How bad?" Isabella said, because she'd learned to read Priya's silences the same way you learn to read weather. "Depends on your reference point." Priya sat down across from her, which she only did when a conversation required it. If your reference point is a company operating within reasonable margins of normal dysfunction, bad. If your reference point is deliberate and sustained misconduct, thorough. Isabella opened the folder. The financials came first. Crestline Logistics had been operating at a loss for 14 months, which was not in itself unusual for a regional carrier navigating the post-pandemic freight adjustment, but the way the losses were structured was specific. The maintenance budget had been cut by 62% over 18 months, not reduced, gutted. The line items that remained were largely cosmetic. Window washing, lot maintenance, the kind of visible upkeep that makes a facility look functional from the outside without touching what happens under the hood. The service contracts told a different story. Crestline held contracts with 3 pharmacy networks, 2 hospital systems, and a regional grocery distributor, all of them temperature-sensitive or time-critical deliveries, all of them reliant on Crestline's representations about vehicle maintenance and driver training. The representations in the contract documents bore no relationship to what the maintenance records showed. Isabella turned to the maintenance records. Priya had organized them chronologically, and reading them in sequence was like watching something erode in fast forward. The inspection logs that Liam had photographed, the falsified timestamps, the checkboxes marked complete without corresponding service entries, were not isolated incidents. They were the pattern. Across 31 vehicles over 22 months, a consistent and documented practice of logging maintenance that had not occurred. She set that section aside and moved to personnel. The termination records were the part that made her jaw tighten. 14 employees had been let go in the past 2 years. Of those 14, 9 had filed internal complaints in the 90 days preceding their termination. Complaints about safety conditions, vehicle maintenance, dispatching practices, route documentation. 3 of them had filed those complaints through the same regional reporting channel that Liam had used in January. None of them had received documented responses. She read each of the 9 profiles. They were ordinary in the way that most people are ordinary. Work histories, family situations, the particular vulnerability of people who can't afford to lose a job. A 51-year-old driver named Raymond Oakes, who'd been with Crestline for 7 years before reporting a transmission problem and being let go for performance issues 3 weeks later. A dispatcher named Carla Menton, who'd flagged a routing irregularity that turned out to be connected to an unauthorized subcontracting arrangement and been told her position had been eliminated. A mechanic, Crestline employed 2 on site, named Hector Diaz, who had documented the brake issue on truck 14 4 months before Liam had, submitted the same kind of report and been let go a month later. She stopped at that one. Hector Diaz had documented the brake issue on truck 14 before Liam, which meant Liam's complaint, the one from January that had gone unanswered, was actually the second formal documentation of the same problem. Someone in the Crestline regional office had received both of them, had done nothing about either of them. She turned the page. Truck 14 was still in rotation. She looked out the kitchen window at the November brown backyard for a moment, the ornamental grass her landscaper had planted along the fence, the flagstone path she'd never quite liked but hadn't gotten around to changing. She thought about what it would mean for a vehicle with documented brake problems to be driven daily by someone who needed the job too much to refuse. She thought about Route 11, which was 63 miles of mountain road. She thought about what could have happened on Route 11 if things had gone differently. Not to her, to Liam, to the driver of a vehicle that shouldn't have been on the road, on a mountain road in a rainstorm. She turned back to the file. The ownership structure was the last section. Crestline Logistics was owned by a man named Douglas Hart, 61, who had acquired the company 8 years ago as part of a small portfolio of regional logistics and freight operations. The others in the portfolio had been sold off over the years. Crestline remained, losing money with a consistency that suggested it was serving some purpose other than profit, which the financial records, when examined with that question in mind, eventually answered. Crestline was being used as a pass-through entity for a web of billing arrangements between Hart's other interests that required a logistics operation to appear operational without needing to actually function efficiently. In plain language, Crestline didn't need to make money because it was making money for something else, and the employees and the routes and the vehicles and the medical deliveries were all secondary to that purpose. The safety of the drivers, the reliability of the pharmacy shipments, the brake condition of Truck 14, none of it appeared in Douglas Hart's calculations because none of it needed to. Isabella closed the folder. She sat with it for a moment. The window light was thin and gray, the kind of November light that makes everything look like it's waiting for something. She thought about the question she'd been turning over for 9 days, ever since she'd read the Courier article in her home office with a legal pad beside her, whether this was something she was going to involve herself in, and if so, how, and to what end. The answer had been forming slowly, the way answers do when you're honest with yourself about what you already know. She had the resources to acquire Crestline. Not easily. It would require restructuring a line of credit and pulling from the discretionary acquisition fund she'd been holding for a different opportunity, but it was within reach. More importantly, Crestline's debt structure made it acquirable in a way that Douglas Hart could resist, but probably couldn't stop if she moved correctly. What stopped her from deciding immediately was not the money. It was the question of whether this was a decision being made from a clear place or from a compromised one. She had 43 stitches across her forehead and a broken wrist, and a specific memory of a man's hands in the dark. And she was aware that these things were influencing her the way personal experience always influences judgment, whether you want it to or not. She'd learned to name that influence without letting it make the decision for her. The personal reason was what it was. The business case had to stand on its own. She went through the Crestline financials again, this time with a different question. Was there a viable operation underneath the mismanagement? The vehicles, neglected as they were largely salvageable with proper maintenance investment. The contracts with the pharmacy networks and hospital systems were renewable. 2 of them had renewal clauses that would trigger automatically if Crestline's service metrics hit certain thresholds, and those thresholds were achievable with functional vehicles and proper routing. The workforce, minus the leadership structure that had built and maintained the culture of negligence, was largely intact. 14 good people had been pushed out. Others had stayed. She thought about Raymond Oakes. She thought about Carla Menton. She thought about Hector Diaz, who had written down the truth about Truck 14 and been let go for it. She thought about Liam Parker, who had done the same thing 4 months later and had also been let go for it, and who was currently working at a shop in Graysville for $19.50 an hour and no benefits. The business case was real. The operation could be turned around. But what made Isabella make the final decision was simpler than any of that. It was the Truck 14 service record sitting in front of her, and the understanding that it was going out on routes tomorrow and the day after, and that someone was driving it. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. His name was Forrest Kwan, and he'd been Isabella's primary counsel for 4 years, which was long enough that he no longer expressed surprise at the speed of her decisions, only at their direction. She gave him a 15-minute overview of the Crestline situation, her read of the debt structure, and what she needed in terms of a formal acquisition approach. There was a pause on his end. "This is a money-losing regional carrier with a documented liability exposure," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the professional version of, "Are you sure?" "With renewable contracts and a salvageable workforce," Isabella said. "And you want to move how quickly?" "I want the initial approach within the week. I want the acquisition completed within 30 days if Hart is cooperative. Faster if he's not." "He's going to push back." "He can push back. What he can't do is make his debt position better between now and when we make the offer." She paused. "Also, Forrest, flag the maintenance records to the Tennessee Department of Transportation. Do it separate from the acquisition process, through the appropriate regulatory channel. Not as leverage. Because Truck 14 is still on the road." Another pause. Longer this time. "You want to flag the regulatory issue before you own the company?" "Yes, which will complicate the acquisition." "I know. Most people would wait until after the acquisition to, I know what most people would do." A beat. Then, "Okay, I'll have the initial structure to you by Monday." She hung up and sat for a moment with the file still open in front of her. The thing about doing something the right way, Isabella had learned, was that it was rarely also the easy way. It was usually slower, or more complicated, or more expensive, or some combination of all three. People who did things the right way were not rewarded consistently or quickly. Sometimes they weren't rewarded at all. She'd believed for a long time that this was just a fact about the world that you accepted. Lately, she'd been less sure she wanted to accept it. She closed the folder. She had phone calls to make and a leadership meeting to plan, and her wrist ached under the cast in the way it did when she'd been sitting still too long. She stood up and went to make coffee and thought, briefly, about a 7-year-old girl's birthday candles and the man who had come home too late to light them. Douglas Hart received the formal acquisition offer on a Tuesday, 11 days after Forrest Kwan had made the initial approach. The offer was precise and not particularly generous. Isabella's team had structured it to be fair to the debt holders and to Crestline's employees, which meant it was considerably less fair to Hart himself, who had been extracting value from the operation in ways that the offer conspicuously did not credit. He didn't respond for 4 days. Isabella knew what that meant. She'd been in enough negotiations to understand the silence of a man who is making calls, trying to find another buyer or another source of leverage, and not finding one. She let it sit. On the 5th day, Hart's attorney called Forrest with a counteroffer that was 40% higher than the original and included a provision requiring Crestline's current management team to stay in place for a minimum of 18 months. Isabella read the counter and set it aside. She called Forrest. "Tell them no on the price and no on the management retention clause. Tell them we'll hold at the original offer for another 72 hours. He's going to say no. Then he's going to say no, and we'll move to the secondary structure." The secondary structure, which Forrest's team had prepared but which Isabella had hoped not to need, involved going directly to Crestline's primary lender, a regional bank that held the majority of the company's operational debt, and making them an offer for the debt itself. It was technically cleaner than a direct acquisition, but considerably more aggressive, and it removed Hart's ability to refuse at all. Isabella didn't like doing it that way. She preferred clean lines, but she had also flagged the Truck 14 situation to the Tennessee DOT 10 days ago, and the regulatory timeline was not going to wait for Douglas Hart to make up his mind. Hart responded in 60 hours. His attorney called Forrest with a revised counter, lower price, modified management clause that required only 60 days of transition support rather than 18 months. It was still not what Isabella had offered, but it was a different kind of negotiation, the kind where someone has accepted the fundamental outcome and is arguing about details. They settled on terms in 3 more days. The final price was 8% above Isabella's original offer, which Forrest considered a reasonable outcome and Isabella considered acceptable. The management transition was structured at 90 days, with Isabella's team in operational control immediately upon closing. The acquisition closed on a Friday afternoon. Forrest called her when the final signatures were through. "It's done," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Forrest." "What's the first move?" "Monday morning," she said. "I want a leadership meeting. Everyone at the director level and above. The full Millhaven management team. Should I be there?" "Yes." "Bring the documentation file." She hung up and sat with it for a moment. The specific quality of quiet that comes after a large thing is finished, before the next large thing begins. Her wrist still ached. The cast was scheduled to come off in 2 weeks, and she was looking forward to it with a feeling that surprised her in its intensity. She'd never broken a bone before. She hadn't realized how much of ordinary function a wrist controlled until that function was gone. She thought about Liam Parker. She'd thought about him more times over the past 3 weeks than she'd expected to. Not constantly, not obsessively, but the way you think about something that remains unresolved. She had his contact information through Priya's research. She hadn't used it. She hadn't been sure what to say, or when, or whether saying anything before the situation was resolved made sense. She was aware that she was not objective about him in the way she was usually objective about things, and she decided to let the business process complete before she introduced anything personal into the picture. The Monday meeting was first. The Crestline Logistics Facility on the south side of Millhaven had a conference room on the 2nd floor that overlooked the vehicle bay. A functional room with no pretension to anything, drop ceiling, fluorescent lights, a whiteboard that had seen better days. Isabella arrived at 8:30 a.m. Forrest arrived at 8:45. The management team filed in between 8:50 and 9, and Isabella watched them come in the way she always watched a room assemble itself before a meeting, where people chose to sit, who sat next to whom, who took the chairs close to the door. Douglas Hart was not present. His 90-day transition agreement did not require his attendance at this meeting, and Isabella had not invited him. His designated transition liaison was a man named Philip Garrett, who was Crestline's vice president of operations, and who had been in that role for 6 years, which meant he'd been in that role through all of it. He was 54, with the specific self-possession of a man who had learned to be comfortable in rooms where decisions were made about other people. He sat at the right end of the table with a notepad and a water bottle, and the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that the power in the room had changed, but hadn't yet decided how to position himself relative to the change. There were 7 people around the table. Isabella stood at the front of the room. She didn't have slides. She hadn't prepared a presentation in the traditional sense. She had the documentation file, which Forrest had brought in a banker's box, and she had a very clear sense of what needed to happen in this room. She started by letting them settle. She did this deliberately. Gave them 30 seconds of silence after the door was closed, which was long enough to make a room uncomfortable and short enough that no one could object to it. Then she said, "I want to play something for you." She opened her laptop on the table in front of her and turned it so the screen faced the room. The video was security footage from the Crestline facility parking lot. Internal camera, the kind the company had installed for insurance purposes and that the management team clearly hadn't thought about. The timestamp read the night of the accident, 8:38 p.m. The footage showed Truck 11, the vehicle Liam Parker had been driving, leaving the facility at the start of his route. Then she moved the timestamp forward, 9:51 p.m., the truck returning. She paused it there. From 8:38 to 9:51, she said, that truck was on Route 11, which runs north along State Route 9. During that window, the driver, Liam Parker, one of your former employees, completed all 4 pharmacy delivery stops on the route. She moved to the document. Here are the pharmacy confirmation timestamps, 9:04, 9:17, 9:31, 9:44. She set the paper down. He made every stop. He completed the route. He also stopped on State Route 9 near mile marker 41 to respond to a vehicle accident called 911 and pulled the accident victim out of the car before the vehicle caught fire. The room was quiet. He was fired the next morning, Isabella said, for abandoning the route. Garrett cleared his throat. That was a personnel decision based on... I know what it was based on, Isabella said. She kept her voice even. Not cold. She'd learned a long time ago that cold was less effective than precise. I've read the termination documentation. I've also read the safety complaint Mr. Parker submitted in January and the safety complaint submitted by Hector Diaz in September of the previous year about the same vehicle, and the pattern of terminations following internal safety complaints going back 22 months. She looked at Garrett directly. I'm not asking you to explain any of that right now. I'm telling you what the documentation shows so that we're all operating from the same facts. She opened the banker's box and Forrest began passing out stapled document packets, 1 per person, 14 pages each, organized by category. What you have in front of you, Isabella said, is an internal review of Crestline's maintenance records, personnel files, and operational compliance over the past 2 years. I'm not going to walk through it page by page. You're going to read it. What I'm going to tell you is what happens next, and I want to be clear before I do that. I didn't buy this company to dismantle it. I bought it because it has contracts with hospital systems and pharmacy networks that provide essential services to this region, and those contracts depend on a functioning, compliant operation, and this operation has not been functioning or compliant. She let that sit for a moment. The people in this room who built and maintained the practices documented in that packet, who signed off on falsified inspections, who processed retaliatory terminations, who received safety complaints and filed them away, those people are not going to be part of what comes next. That process starts today. She paused. The people in this room who kept their heads down and did their jobs and didn't make trouble because they couldn't afford to. I understand the position that puts a person in. I'm not interested in making you pay for other people's decisions. She watched them. Some of them were looking at the document packet. Some were looking at her. Garrett was looking at the table. I'm going to ask each of you to schedule a one-on-one meeting with Forrest's team this week, she said. You'll have the opportunity to tell us what you know and what your role was, in your own words, before we make any determinations. If you'd prefer to have counsel present for that conversation, that's your right, and I'd recommend it. She closed her laptop. The vehicles, she said. All 31 vehicles in the current fleet are going into maintenance review starting today. No truck leaves this facility until it's been inspected and cleared. I've already spoken with the dispatch team about route coverage. She looked at the operations manager, a woman named Sandra Park, who had been the quietest person in the room and who had, according to the personnel files, never filed or dismissed a safety complaint in either direction. Sandra, I'll need you to coordinate with dispatch on the rescheduling. I know it creates problems. We're going to work through them. Sandra Park nodded once. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a while. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Logistics, timeline, immediate operational priorities. By the end of it, 3 people had been formally put on administrative leave pending the individual reviews, which included Garrett. The remaining 4 had assignments and a point of contact, and the particular expression of people who have survived something they weren't sure they would survive. When the room had cleared, Forrest gathered his materials and looked at Isabella over the top of the banker's box. That went about as expected. Garrett's going to lawyer up by noon. Definitely. He tucked a folder under his arm. The individual reviews are going to take 2 weeks at minimum. I know. And the route coverage issue is going to be a problem for at least a month while the fleet goes through inspection. Sandra will handle it. She knows the operation. Forrest looked at her for a moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since before I made the offer. He nodded. He was used to this. Isabella doing more thinking before the decision than most people did afterward. There's one more thing, he said. The 9 employees who were terminated following safety complaints. What's your position on restitution? Full review of each termination, she said without hesitation. Wrongful termination compensation where the record supports it, which based on what I've read, it does for most of them. Reinstatement offers where it makes sense and where the person wants to come back. That's a significant expense. It's a significant wrong. She picked up her laptop. Let's not use the word expense for the cost of fixing something that should have been fixed 2 years ago. Forrest allowed himself something close to a smile. Yes, ma'am. She drove home along the south side of Millhaven, through the industrial district that gave way to commercial streets that gave way to the residential grid, where the neighborhoods got smaller and older. She passed through the part of town where Callaway Street was, though she didn't turn down it. She'd looked it up once on a map. She'd looked at the satellite view of the block, the small houses, the narrow driveways, the welcome mats and pickup trucks that told you the texture of the neighborhood without being specific enough to tell you anything else. She hadn't gone further than the map. It wasn't the right moment. She'd known that clearly enough to respect it. She drove home. She made tea because her wrist was aching and she'd been on her feet most of the morning, and she was still, 2.5 weeks post-accident, working on something closer to 90% than she usually demanded of herself. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea and a new legal pad, and she made a list of the next 30 days, the individual reviews, the fleet inspection timeline, the operational restructuring, the contract renewals that needed attention before the end of the quarter. She wrote Liam Parker's name about halfway down the list. Not at the top. There were more urgent things, but not at the bottom either. She looked at it for a moment. Then she kept writing. What she didn't know, and what she would find out later, in the way that people find out things that run parallel to their own story without intersecting until the moment they do, was that Liam Parker had seen the news coverage that morning. He'd seen it on his phone during the 20-minute drive to Graysville, pulled over on the shoulder because the notification from the courier had caught his eye and he'd needed to read it. The headline, Sterling Capital acquires Crestline Logistics. Investigation launched into safety practices. He'd read the article in the gray morning light of a county road shoulder, with the truck's hazards on. The article didn't name him. It referenced a former employee whose safety complaint had gone unanswered as part of the regulatory flag that had preceded the acquisition. It mentioned that the Tennessee DOT had opened a compliance review. It quoted Forrest Kwan, identified as Sterling Capital's legal counsel, on the company's commitment to operational reform. Sterling Capital. He looked up from his phone at the road ahead of him. The name connected, the same way it had when Dana Rourke had said it over bad coffee in the Milner Avenue coffee shop. Sterling Capital Group. The woman he'd pulled out of the burning car. He thought about the sequence, the accident, the article, the acquisition, the timing. He was not a person who believed in neat coincidences, because his experience of the world had been that things didn't generally arrange themselves neatly for anyone's benefit. He knew how to fix cars because machines had logic and predictable failure points, and he could work with that. People were more complicated. Situations were more complicated. But sitting on the shoulder of a county road in the gray morning, with the hazards ticking, he thought about a woman who had been in the hospital with a concussion and a broken wrist, reading a newspaper article about the man who'd pulled her out of a car, and then apparently going out and buying the company that had fired him. He didn't know what to do with that. He turned the hazards off and pulled back onto the road. He thought about it through most of the morning between jobs. An alignment on a work truck, a timing belt replacement that took longer than estimated because the last mechanic who touched it had used the wrong grade of fastener and hadn't noted it anywhere. He worked and thought and arrived at no particular conclusion except that something was happening that was bigger than him and that he didn't yet know his place in it. At lunch he called Marcus, not for any specific reason. He just wanted to talk to someone who knew the full shape of the thing from the beginning. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "I saw the news," he said, before Liam could start. "Yeah." "Sterling Capital, the woman from the car." "Yeah." A pause. Marcus had never been a person who filled silence just to fill it. "How do you feel about it?" Liam thought about that. He was sitting in the Graysville shop parking lot with a sandwich he'd made that morning. Turkey and mustard, the bread slightly stale because he'd forgotten to close the bag properly. "Weird," he said. "I feel weird." "Weird like bad?" "Weird like I don't know what it means yet." He unwrapped the sandwich. "She bought the whole company." "Apparently." "Because of what they did." "Looks like it." "That's, He stopped. He didn't have the right word for what it was. Not gratitude exactly because it wasn't directed at him, or not only at him. Not surprise exactly because some part of him had always believed, more stubbornly than was probably rational, that the thing he'd documented and submitted and tried to make visible was real and mattered and should be dealt with. He just never expected someone to actually deal with it at this scale. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's a lot." "You saved her life," Marcus said, plainly, the way Marcus said most things. "She's a person who apparently does something when she sees something that needs doing. Sounds like maybe you two aren't that different." Liam ate half his sandwich thinking about that. "How's the new shop?" Marcus asked. "Good. Ted's solid. The pay's better than Darrow's." "Good coffee?" He almost laughed. Sophie had asked the same thing. "Better," he said. "Not great, but better." "High bar," Marcus said. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. Marcus's oldest starting college applications, a vintage Mustang that had come into Darrow's that week, the weather turning, the ordinary things. Liam finished his sandwich and went back inside and spent the afternoon working and not thinking, which was one of the things he was genuinely good at. He picked Sophie up at 3:45. She had paint on her left hand and a construction paper turkey that she'd made in art class, and that she presented to him in the parking lot with an artist's seriousness. "It's very good," he said, examining it. "The feathers are supposed to be better," she said, "but we ran out of time." "I like the feathers." "You're just saying that." "I'm saying it and I mean it." She considered him. She was getting better at distinguishing between when he meant things and when he was being apparent, which he found both impressive and slightly alarming. "Okay," she said finally, and got in the truck. He put the paper turkey on the dashboard. He didn't tell her about the news. She was 7, and the Crestline story was not a 7-year-old story. But driving home through the gray November afternoon with the paper turkey on the dashboard and Sophie telling him about the fractions quiz and how Kezia had gotten the same score as her and they'd celebrated in the bathroom by doing the 7-step handshake twice, Liam thought. This is what he'd been working toward. All of it. The complaint he'd filed. The jobs he'd kept even when they cost him. All of it pointed here. This truck, this drive home, this kid. The water stain on the bedroom ceiling was still spreading. The gutters were still pulling away from the fascia on the left side. He still didn't have benefits for another month. These were true things, and he held them clearly. He didn't romanticize his situation. He never had. But there was something different about the drive home that evening. Something that had shifted in the quality of the air, the way the day sat in his chest. Not resolution, not yet, but the specific feeling of a thing that has been wrong for a long time beginning, somewhere out of sight, to turn toward something else. He didn't have a name for it yet. He was about to get one. The call came on a Wednesday, 11 days after the leadership meeting at Crestline. Liam was under a Ford F-250 at the Graysville shop, working a rusted exhaust clamp that had no intention of cooperating, when Ted Haskell appeared at the edge of the bay and said, "Parker, phone call, says it's important." Liam didn't get phone calls at the shop. He had a cell phone. Everyone had a cell phone. When someone called the shop's main line asking for him by name, it meant something deliberate, someone who'd gone looking for him rather than finding a number. He slid out from under the truck and wiped his hands on a shop rag. Ted handed him the receiver from the front desk phone with the expression of a man who had decided not to ask questions. "This is Liam Parker." The voice on the other end was professional and warm and introduced herself as Priya Mehta, assistant to Isabella Sterling. She said that Ms. Sterling would like to meet with Liam at his earliest convenience, that she understood this was an unusual request, and that she wanted to assure him the meeting was entirely at his discretion. There was no obligation, no pressure, and if he'd prefer not to meet, that would be respected completely. Liam stood at the front desk with the receiver in his hand and looked at the service board on the wall. 8 vehicles slotted for the day, 3 of them already done. He thought about Marcus on the phone last week saying sounds like maybe you two aren't that different. He thought about a paper turkey on his dashboard. "When?" he said. A brief pause. The pause of someone who had prepared for more resistance than this. "She's available Thursday afternoon or Friday morning, whichever works better for you." "Thursday afternoon," he said, "after 3. "Perfect. I'll send the address to your cell, and Mr. Parker, thank you." He handed the receiver back to Ted, who was pointedly focused on a work order clipboard. "Everything okay?" Ted said, not looking up. "Yeah," Liam said. "I think so." He went back under the F-250 and went back to work on the exhaust clamp, which eventually gave up the fight around noon. He didn't think too much about Thursday. Thinking too much about something before it happened had never done him much good. It just gave the anxiety more material to work with. He told Sophie at dinner that he had a meeting after work on Thursday and would be a little late. She asked what kind of meeting. He said a work thing. She asked if it was about the new job. He said, not exactly. She accepted this with the pragmatic incuriosity of a child who has learned that adult work things are generally boring and not worth the follow-up question. Then she asked if they could have cereal for dinner instead of what he was making, and the meeting was forgotten. Thursday came the way Thursdays do. Not dramatically, just another morning, the alarm at 4:47, the coffee, the drive to Graysville, the work. He got through 5 vehicles before noon and was halfway through a transmission service on a Chevy Silverado when 3 o'clock arrived and he cleaned up, changed out of his coveralls in the bathroom, and stood for a moment looking at himself in the mirror above the sink. He looked like what he was, a mechanic who'd had a long day. There were grease traces along his jawline that the soap hadn't fully reached, and his collar was wrinkled from being folded under the coveralls all day. He did what he could with what he had, wet his hair, straightened his shirt, got the jawline mostly clean. He wasn't trying to be something he wasn't. He just didn't want to walk into a meeting looking like he'd just crawled out from under a truck. He drove to the address Priya had sent. It was not the Sterling Capital Group offices downtown. He'd half expected that. The glass building he'd passed on his way through the commercial district. It was a house on the north side of Millhaven, in one of the older neighborhoods that had gone expensive the way certain parts of every city go expensive, slowly and then all at once. The houses were large without being showy, set back from the street behind mature trees, the kind of neighborhood where the money was real but had been there long enough to stop announcing itself. He pulled into the driveway behind a black SUV and sat in the truck for a moment. He was not nervous exactly. He was something adjacent to nervous, the heightened attention of someone entering a situation they don't fully understand yet. He got out of the truck. Priya answered the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching for him. She was younger than he'd imagined from the phone, mid-20s, efficient in her movements, with the particular quality of someone who manages complexity for a living and has gotten very good at making it look easy. She thanked him for coming, took his jacket, and led him through a front hallway into a sitting room that connected to a larger kitchen where someone had recently made coffee. He could smell it. "She'll be right in," Priya said. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be good. Thank you." Priya disappeared toward the kitchen. Liam stood in the sitting room and looked at it. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a reading chair with a lamp angled over it, and an open book face down on the arm. A standing desk in the corner with a laptop and 2 monitors, and the general organized density of someone who did a lot of work from home. On the windowsill, a small succulent in a terracotta pot that had seen better days and was listing slightly to the left. It was the succulent that settled something in him, in a way he couldn't have explained. The rest of the room was composed. The succulent was just a plant that someone hadn't quite gotten around to. He heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Isabella Sterling came into the room. He recognized her and didn't recognize her at the same time. He'd seen her in the dark, in the rain, in the narrow window of a burning car. Not her face exactly, but the shape of her, the quality of her consciousness as she tried to stay with him. Now she was upright and fully present and wearing a cast on her right wrist that was a faded white. The edges softened from weeks of use. She had 43 stitches worth of scar along her left temple, still visible even where it had begun to fade. And she was looking at him the way he was looking at her, with the particular attention of someone trying to reconcile a person they knew in one context with the person standing in front of them now. She was the first one to speak. "You look different," she said, "from what I remember. You were in and out of consciousness." "I was." Something moved across her face. Not embarrassment exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a vulnerability she'd had no control over. "I remember hands and a voice. That was me." "I know." She gestured toward the seating area. 2 chairs at an angle, a low table between them. "Please sit down." They sat. Priya came back with coffee. 2 mugs, black, which was how Liam drank it, and which he understood was how Isabella drank it too, because there was no accompaniment of sugar or cream. Small things. He noticed small things. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was the silence of 2 people who have a shared experience that preceded their acquaintance and who are trying to figure out how to approach it. Isabella set her coffee down. "I want to say thank you," she said. "And I want to say it plainly, without a lot of surrounding language, because I think you're the kind of person who would prefer that. I'm not sure I need— You pulled me out of a burning car," she said. "You went down a 40-foot slope in the dark in a rainstorm, and you pulled me out and carried me back up, and you stayed until help was coming. I was alone on that road. If you hadn't stopped—" She paused, not for effect, because the sentence had a real end to it that she seemed to be sitting with. "I'd like to say thank you for that." He held it for a moment. He wasn't good at being thanked. Not for things that felt like reflexes rather than decisions. He'd stopped because stopping was what you did. He'd gone down the slope because there was someone down there. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." She said it with a directness that was not impatient but was clear. "I want to." He nodded. "Then, you're welcome." She held his eyes for a moment. Then something shifted in her posture, the way it shifts when a person moves from one part of a conversation to the next. "I also want to talk about Crestline," she said. "Okay. I've been going through the documentation from the internal review. I read your complaint, the January one, and the one before it from a mechanic named Hector Diaz." She picked up her coffee. "You both documented the same vehicle, 4 months apart, through the same reporting channel, and neither of you received any response." "That's right." "And you kept a copy?" "Yeah." "Why?" The question was direct enough that it caught him slightly off guard. Not why keep a copy in the abstract. Why specifically, what was he thinking when he decided to do it? He thought about the kitchen table in January, the documents spread out, the particular late-night feeling of knowing something true that nobody official was responding to. "Because I thought someone might eventually need it," he said, "and because I didn't want it to be like it never happened." She looked at him. "That's a careful thing to do." I had a daughter to think about. I couldn't afford to do something impulsive. But you filed the complaint anyway, even knowing it might cost you. It cost me eventually, he said. Not bitterly, just factually. It did. She set down her coffee and looked at the window for a moment. The gray November afternoon, the bare trees. The review identified 9 former employees who were terminated following safety complaints. Yours makes 10. Each of those terminations is being reviewed for wrongful termination compensation. She looked back at him. I want to be clear that this is not a gesture. This is a legal process. Forrest Kwan's team is handling each case individually based on the documentation. In your case, the documentation is thorough. He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected walking into this meeting, but he'd been careful not to expect anything specific. He'd learned that lesson. Okay, he said. She seemed to read something in the single word because she leaned forward slightly. Liam. She used his first name for the first time, and something about it landed differently than names usually land. It had the quality of someone who'd thought about how to say it. I'm not here to hand you a check and call it settled. What happened to you, and to the others, was a pattern of institutional retaliation against people who were right. Compensating you for a wrongful termination is the floor. It's the minimum of what's owed. It's not the conversation I actually want to have. He waited. She picked up a folder from the table beside her chair. He hadn't noticed it there, and opened it. Crestline's operational structure is being rebuilt from the ground up. That includes safety compliance, fleet maintenance, and route management. The person who runs safety operations needs to understand both sides of what went wrong, the mechanical side and the documentation side. They need to know what it looks like when a system fails, because they've been inside a failing system and survived it. She held out the folder to him. I'd like you to read the job description. He took the folder. The title on the page read, Director of Operational Safety, Crestline Logistics. He read it the way he read work orders, methodically, front to back, not skimming. The responsibilities were specific and substantial. Fleet maintenance oversight, safety compliance documentation, driver training program development, regulatory liaison. It was a senior position. The salary listed at the bottom of the page was more than he'd earned in the last 2 years combined. He read it twice. Then he set the folder on the table between them. I don't have a management background, he said. I'm a mechanic. I drive delivery routes. You identified a safety violation that 2 other people missed. You documented it correctly, submitted it through the proper channels, kept a copy when the system failed, and maintained your position under pressure that resulted in you losing 2 jobs in 1 morning. She didn't look away. That's not a mechanic's skill set. That's an integrity skill set. The technical knowledge you can build on. The other thing you either have or you don't. He sat with that. He thought about the water stain on the ceiling. He thought about the gutter pulling away from the fascia. He thought about Sophie's medication copays and the 78-day wait on benefits at the Graysville shop. He thought about the legal pad where he made lists of actions instead of worries. He thought about Hector Diaz, who had written down the truth about Truck 14 and been let go for it. He thought about Raymond Oakes, 7 years at the company, out the door in 3 weeks for asking the right question. He thought about the fact that Truck 14 was no longer on the road, that Priya's regulatory flag and the DOT inspection had pulled it from service the week after the acquisition closed, and what it might have taken for that to not be true, for things to have kept going the way they were going. What happened to the other employees, he said. The 9 from the review. Isabella was quiet for a moment, as if the question was one she'd been expecting but still wanted to meet carefully. 4 have accepted reinstatement offers. Different roles than before, better ones. 3 have declined reinstatement and accepted compensation settlements. 2 are still deciding. She paused. Raymond Oakes starts back Monday. Carla Menton's taking a different position. She didn't want to go back into dispatch, which is completely understandable. Hector Diaz, she paused again. He's the one I most want to bring back. He documented the brake issue first. He's been out of work for 9 months. You talked to him. Priya talked to him. He was careful. He wanted to know if it was real. That's fair? It is. She looked at him directly. Same question applies to you. I want you to know that this offer is real, not a placeholder, not a gesture. I need someone in this role who will do it the way you filed that complaint, because it's the right thing, not because it's convenient or safe. The job is going to be hard. The company has a lot of work to do and not a lot of runway to do it in before the contract renewals come up. She let that land. But I think you're the right person for it, and I don't say that to the wrong person. He looked at the folder on the table. He thought about Ted Haskell, who had given him a fair shot and treated him decently. He thought about how to leave that gracefully. I'd need to give Ted proper notice, he said. 2 weeks. Something shifted in Isabella's face. Not quite a smile, but the arrangement of features that precedes one. That's a yes. That's a yes with conditions. 2 weeks is fine. She picked up her coffee. The position doesn't officially open until January 1st. There's a lot of structural work between now and then that I'll need help with. If you're willing to consult during the transition period, what kind of help? Fleet assessment. The maintenance team is doing physical inspections, but I want someone who knows what they're looking at to walk through the findings and tell me what the priorities are. Not a report for a board, a plain read of what's fixable and what's not and in what order. I can do that. I know you can. She set down the mug. I also want to be straightforward about something. The situation between us is unusual. You saved my life. I've bought the company that fired you. Those two things are connected in ways that could make the professional relationship complicated if we let them. She met his eyes. I don't intend to let them. The job offer is based on what I've read in the documentation and what I've learned about how you operate. Not on gratitude. Gratitude is what the thank you was for. This is separate. He appreciated that more than he would have known how to say. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They talked for another hour and a half about the fleet, about the route structure, about the specific regulatory requirements that the DOT compliance review had flagged as priorities. It was a practical conversation, the kind where two people who know different things about the same problem work through it from different angles. He told her what he'd seen in the vehicle logs. She told him what the financial restructuring looked like from the operational side. They disagreed twice. Once about the timeline for the fleet inspection, and once about whether to keep the current dispatch software or replace it. And both disagreements were productive in the way that disagreements between people paying attention tend to be. By the time Priya knocked softly on the doorframe to let Isabella know her 5 o'clock call was in 10 minutes, Liam had a clearer picture of what the next 6 months of work looked like than he'd had walking in. He stood and picked up his jacket. One more thing, Isabella said, standing. The documentation you gave Dana Rourke, the Courier article. Yeah. That's part of what made this possible. The regulatory flag, the public record, the pressure on the acquisition timeline. You didn't plan it that way. No. But it mattered. She held out her left hand, the unbanded one, the one without the cast, and he shook it. Her grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who meant it. Monday, if you can. I'll have Priya send you the fleet files. Monday works. He drove home through the early dark of a November evening, the streetlights coming on along the commercial strip, the last of the day's traffic thinning out as he moved into the residential neighborhoods. He drove through the part of town where Callaway Street was, and this time he turned down it, because it was the way home, and it had always been the way home. The house looked the same, the gutter still pulling away from the fascia, the welcome mat still fraying. He'd get to the gutter this weekend, he thought. He'd been saying that for 2 months, but now there was something different about the saying of it. Not urgency exactly, more like the gutter was now a task rather than a weight. He picked Sophie up from Mrs. Garza's, where she'd been since after school. Mrs. Garza had fed her. Something with rice, Sophie reported approvingly. And Sophie was in the middle of telling him about a disagreement she'd had with Kezia about which animal was smarter, a dolphin or a crow, and had anyone considered that maybe both were smart in different ways. What do you think? He asked. I think Kezia is being competitive about it, Sophie said, with the air of someone who has achieved considerable perspective. That's very mature of you. I know. She looked out the window. Also, crows can recognize faces. That's pretty smart. That is pretty smart. Dolphins can do math, though. Can they? I think so. We're going to look it up. He pulled into the driveway and they went inside. He made dinner. Real dinner this time, chicken and rice, nothing ambitious but cooked properly and hot. Sophie ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had already eaten once and was eating a second time purely out of enthusiasm. He watched her and thought about the January complaint in the manila envelope and the 40-minute drive up a mountain road in a rainstorm, and 2 milk crates of tools in a parking lot and a meeting in a sitting room with a dying succulent on the windowsill, and how the line from one point to the next was not straight, but was, somehow, continuous. After dinner, he helped her with reading homework, a chapter of a book about a girl who discovers her grandmother can talk to birds, which Sophie found credible and interesting. And then she had a bath, and he told her the rabbit story again, the one about the mountain and the interesting rocks, except this time the rabbit made it to the top. "What did she see?" Sophie asked. He thought about it. "Everything," he said. "She could see the whole way she'd come." Sophie considered this. "Could she see where she was going next?" "Some of it." "Not all of it?" "You never see all of it from the top," he said. "You just see further than you could before." Sophie seemed satisfied with this. She pulled Mr. Flops under her arm and closed her eyes, and Liam sat in the chair beside her bed in the low light of the nightlight until her breathing evened out. Then he went to the kitchen and called Ted Haskell. Ted picked up on the third ring, the sound of a television in the background. "Parker, everything okay?" "Yeah, I need to talk to you about something. Got a few minutes?" A brief pause. The television sound lowered. "Sure, what's going on?" He told Ted plainly, the way Ted deserved. He explained the Crestline situation, the acquisition, the offer, what the role was. He said he understood if Ted was frustrated, that Ted had given him a fair shot when he needed one, and he wasn't taking that for granted. He said he wanted to give proper notice and do it right. Ted was quiet for a moment after he finished. "Crestline Logistics," he said. "Sterling Capital's acquisition." "Yeah. You're the one who filed the safety complaint. I read the Courier article." Liam hadn't expected that. "Yeah." Another pause. "Director of Operational Safety," Ted said. "That's a real job." "It is." "Good." The word was simple and direct, the same way Ted was simple and direct. "You've been a good mechanic to have on the floor, Parker. But I always thought you were going to be better at something bigger." A beat. "You want—" "I'll be a reference." Liam felt something in his chest loosen. "I'd appreciate that, Ted." 2 weeks? 2 weeks. "All right, you'll stay through the Silverado transmission?" He almost laughed. "Yeah, I'll stay through the Silverado." "Good. Those things are a pain in the ass and I don't want to hand it off." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet. The nightlight made its thin line under Sophie's door. Outside, through the kitchen window, the neighborhood was settling into the ordinary dark of a weeknight. A porch light across the street, the distant sound of someone's television, a car passing slow on the wet road. He got a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it, and he let himself feel carefully and without rushing it the particular sensation of a thing that has been grinding for a long time beginning to move differently. Not easily, not without cost, but differently. He thought about Isabella Sterling in the sitting room, the cast on her wrist and the 43 stitches along her temple, talking about integrity as a skill set the same way he talked about torque specifications. He thought about what it meant that she'd separated the thank you from the job offer so deliberately, insisted on it, almost. He understood why. He'd have done the same thing in her position. You couldn't let obligation and opportunity become the same thing. It was messy that way, and messy was how things went wrong. He thought, she's careful. Not cautious, careful. There was a difference. Caution was about protecting yourself. Careful was about not making a mistake that cost someone else. He thought he could work with careful. He thought he'd better be good at this job. He put the glass in the sink and went to the living room and sat in the chair and thought about fleet inspections and compliance timelines and the difference between a maintenance budget that had been cut and one that had been gutted, and what it would take to rebuild a system of accountability in a company that had spent 2 years actively dismantling one. He thought about Hector Diaz, who had been the first one to write it down, and who had spent 9 months out of work for doing it. He thought about what it would mean to build something that protected the next Hector Diaz before the thing happened rather than after. He didn't have all the answers. He was a mechanic who drove delivery routes and had kept a manila envelope in his dresser because it felt wrong to throw it away. He didn't have a management degree or a boardroom history or any of the things that the word director usually implied, but he knew what a failing system looked like from the inside. He knew what it cost. He knew how to write it down and keep the copy and not let the pressure of the thing make him pretend he hadn't seen it. That was, it turned out, exactly what the job required. The 2 weeks passed the way working weeks pass. Faster than expected, slower in the middle, the Silverado transmission resolved on the second-to-last day with the satisfaction of a thing finally completed. Ted shook his hand on the last Friday and said, "Come back if it doesn't work out," which was Ted's version of good luck, and Liam accepted it in the spirit it was offered. He spent the weekend fixing the gutter. It took 3 hours and 2 trips to the hardware store because he bought the wrong bracket the first time, and Sophie handed him things from the bottom of the ladder with the seriousness of an official assistant. And when it was done, he stood back and looked at it, and it wasn't perfect. One section was still slightly low, but it was fixed, and that was what mattered. "Good job," Sophie said. "The angle's still a little off on the left side." She looked at it. "I can't tell." "You can if you know what to look for." She considered this. "Are you going to fix the angle?" "Next weekend." She nodded. "Okay. Then, Dad?" "Yeah." "Is the new job going to be okay?" He looked at her. She was looking up at him with the directness she'd had since she was small. The particular Sophie version of a question, which was never casual, always meant. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "You think so or you know so?" He almost smiled. "I think so. I don't know yet, but I think it's going to be okay." She thought about that. Then she picked up Mr. Flops from where he'd been propped against the ladder and tucked him under her arm. "I think so too," she said. He put the ladder away and they went inside and he made sandwiches and they sat at the kitchen table and she told him more about the dolphin versus crow debate, which apparently had continued throughout the week and had expanded to include hummingbirds as a dark horse candidate. And he listened and ate his sandwich and thought that this, the sandwiches, the table, the hummingbirds, the 7-year-old with the stuffed rabbit who was developing strong opinions about animal cognition, was the reason for all of it. Not the job, not the money, though the money mattered enormously. Not even the rightness of the thing with Crestline, though that mattered too, in a different way. This, the ordinary weight of an ordinary Saturday afternoon. He'd fought for it in the ways he knew how, by showing up, by writing things down, by going down a slope in the dark when he could have driven past. He hadn't done any of it strategically. He hadn't been planning for an outcome. He'd just been trying to get through the week the right way, the way you do when you don't have the luxury of operating any other way. The outcome had come anyway. He was still careful enough not to call that neat. The water stain was still on the ceiling. He'd need to address the roof before spring or it was going to get worse. Sophie's dental appointment was next month, and he hadn't checked whether the new insurance would cover it yet. There were things still pressing, still unresolved, still waiting. But he sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon eating a sandwich and listening to his daughter argue the case for hummingbirds. And he was, without qualification, okay. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. January came in cold and deliberate, the way winter settles into Tennessee hill country. Not dramatic, not the paralyzing cold of northern states, but a persistent gray chill that got into everything and made the mornings feel longer than they were. Liam started his first official day as Director of Operational Safety at Crestline Logistics on a Monday, the second week of the new year, in an office that still had Philip Garrett's nameplate on the door and a motivational poster on the wall behind the desk that said, "Leadership" in block letters above a photograph of a mountain summit. He took the poster down on day one. Not dramatically. He just unpinned it, rolled it up, and left it in the corner. He kept the nameplate out of the door slot because the door was usually open anyway, and the nameplate faced inward, which seemed to defeat the purpose. He put his coffee mug on the desk, opened the fleet assessment files on his laptop, and went to work. The office was small and looked out over the vehicle bay, which he appreciated. He could watch the mechanics working from his desk without making a production of watching them. He could see which trucks were pulling in and which were sitting. He could see at a glance the physical reality of the operation he was responsible for. The first month was the hardest, not because of any single large problem, because of the density of small ones. The fleet inspection had been completed during the transition period, but completion was different from resolution. Of the 31 vehicles, 7 had been cleared for full operation, 14 were operational with documented restrictions, and 10 had been pulled from service, pending repairs, that ranged from the straightforward to the seriously deferred. Truck 14 was among the 10. He walked through it himself in the first week, just to close the loop on something that had been open since January of the previous year. Crouched beside the wheel wells, worked the brake assembly, looked at the records of what had been logged versus what had been done. He wasn't surprised by anything he found, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. The mechanic working beside him was named Dominic, 27, who had been with Crestline for 2 years and had the careful competence of someone who had been doing good work inside a bad system and knew the difference. When Liam stood up from beside the truck's brake assembly, Dominic said, without preamble, "We flagged that brake issue in a daily inspection log 11 months ago. The log was edited." Liam looked at him. "Edited how?" "Entry was deleted. I kept a screenshot." He said it the way Liam had once said, "I kept a copy." Not triumphantly, just factually. The reflex of someone who'd learned not to trust the system to hold the record. "Send it to me," Liam said. "Already did. Send it to your email the day you started." Liam looked at him for a moment. "Good," he said. Dominic nodded and went back to work. And Liam filed the screenshot in the compliance folder and added Dominic's name to a separate document he was building. A list of people in the operation who had been doing the right thing quietly, without recognition, inside a structure that hadn't deserved them. He was building it because he believed those people needed to be seen and named and held on to, before they concluded, reasonably, that being seen and named wasn't worth the effort. The compliance review with the Tennessee DOT ran through February. Liam attended every session. He sat across from the regulatory team with the full documentation, the maintenance records, the falsified inspection logs, the brake records, Dominic's screenshot, his own January complaint, and Hector Diaz's September complaint before it. And he answered every question directly and without deflection. Twice, the regulatory examiner stopped him and asked if he wanted counsel present. Both times he said no. He wasn't there to manage the outcome. He was there to tell the truth about what the record showed. The DOT's findings, issued in March, were thorough and specific. Crestline was cited for 17 separate compliance violations, fined at the upper range of the regulatory schedule, and placed under a 12-month oversight agreement that required quarterly reporting and unannounced inspections. None of it was pleasant. The fine was substantial enough to create real budget pressure in an operation that was already running on a restructured margin. Isabella called him the evening the findings were released. "How bad?" she said. She'd read the report, he knew. Priya had forwarded it the moment it was published, but she was asking for his read, not a summary. "Fair," he said. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the report open on his laptop, Sophie's homework spread at the other end of the table. "The violations are documented accurately. The fine is in range for what was found. The oversight agreement is going to create work, but it's the right call. The press is going to pick it up. Probably. The pharmacy network contracts. 2 of them have compliance clauses. I know. I talked to Sandra this afternoon. Sandra Park, who had stayed and was running dispatch with the kind of quiet authority that made Liam think she'd been capable of much more than Crestline had ever let her do. She thinks both contract managers will want a conversation before they make any decisions. She set up calls for Thursday. I want to be on those calls. I'll tell Priya." A pause. He could hear her thinking, the particular quality of Isabella's silences, which were never empty, always working something through. "You did the right thing in that room," she said, "with the DOT team. I know you didn't have to be that direct." "I did, though." "Not legally." "I know, but I did." He watched Sophie erase something on her worksheet with the aggressive focus of a person who has made a math error and takes it personally. You don't build a system people trust by managing what the regulators know. You build it by letting them see everything and fixing what they find. Another pause. I know that, she said. I just wanted to say it out loud. That you did the right thing. He appreciated it. He didn't always know what to do with Isabella's versions of thank you. She delivered them with a directness that precluded deflection, which meant you actually had to receive them. Okay, he said. Thursday. I'll send you the call details. Good night, Liam. Good night. He closed the laptop and looked at Sophie. She was staring at the worksheet with the expression of someone who has declared war on fractions and is losing. Want help? He said. No. A beat. Yes. He moved down to her end of the table. The Thursday calls went better than they might have. Isabella had the documentation ready and was direct about the violation findings without minimizing them. Here is what was wrong. Here is the documented evidence. Here is what has been corrected and what the oversight agreement requires going forward. The first contract manager, a careful woman named Leslie from the pharmacy network, asked 20 minutes of specific questions and then said she'd need 2 weeks to review and would be in touch. The second, a man named Arthur from the hospital system who had the energy of someone who had heard a lot of promises from a lot of vendors, asked Liam directly, not Isabella, Liam, whether the inspection records could be trusted now. They can be trusted now, Liam said. I'm responsible for them personally. I'll give you my direct line. Any discrepancy you find, you call me. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Why should I believe you're different from the last people who told me the records were accurate? It was a fair question, the right question, actually. Because the last people were invested in you not looking closely, Liam said. I sent you the full DOT compliance report before this call. I didn't redact anything. If I was trying to manage what you knew, that's not how I do it. Another pause. Fair point, Arthur said, and then, I'll want those quarterly reports sent directly to me, not through a media team, the actual reports. Done. Both contracts were renewed by April. Not smoothly. There were additional conditions, additional reporting requirements, a 6-month probationary clause on the hospital system contract that Liam considered entirely reasonable and said so in the negotiation, which Arthur noted with something that might have been surprise. But they were renewed. The operation had contracts. The drivers had routes. The routes were served by vehicles that had been inspected and cleared. Hector Diaz came back in February. It was Liam who'd made the final call, not in the sense of authority, but in the sense of being the one who picked up the phone. Priya had told him that Hector was still undecided, 9 months after being let go, still cautious. Liam understood cautious. He called the number himself without making Priya do it, because he thought the call meant something different coming from him than from an assistant. The phone rang 4 times. Then a man's voice, careful and unhurried. Hello? Hector Diaz? Yeah. My name is Liam Parker. I'm the Director of Operational Safety at Crestline. I filed a complaint about the same vehicle you flagged, about 4 months after you did. A long pause. I know who you are. Read the Courier article. Then you know the situation's changed. I know what the articles say the situation is. Liam respected that. That's fair. Can I tell you what I've seen since I started? You can try. He talked for 20 minutes. Not a sales pitch. He didn't have the temperament for sales pitches, and Hector Diaz would have recognized one immediately. He talked about the fleet inspection findings, Truck 14, the DOT compliance review, the contract renegotiations. He talked about Dominic and the screenshot. He talked about the 12-month oversight agreement and what it actually meant in practice. He was specific because specificity was the only thing that meant anything to someone who had been burned by the general assurances of a system that turned out to be built on falsified records. When he finished, Hector was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the role? Senior fleet mechanic. Better pay than before. You'd report to me directly on compliance documentation. And if I flag something, then I document it, address it, and you keep your job. A pause. I know that should go without saying. It doesn't, given the history, so I'm saying it plainly. Another silence. I want to see the new inspection protocols before I decide. I'll email them tonight. Hector said he'd think about it. He called back 4 days later and said yes. He started the first Monday in February. Liam shook his hand in the vehicle bay, and Dominic, who was already there, already in coveralls, introduced himself, and the two of them got to talking about the Silverado transmission system that had been giving the maintenance team problems, and within 20 minutes they were deep in a technical argument about the right approach to the repair that Liam watched from the doorway of the bay with something close to satisfaction. The water stain on the bedroom ceiling got worse in March, which he'd known it would. He called a roofer and got an estimate that made him wince, and then paid it, because he could, because the salary was real, and the first 3 months of it had rebuilt the savings floor and taken the electric bill off the nightstand and paid for Sophie's dental appointment without the particular mathematics of deciding which necessary thing to defer. The roofer fixed the roof in 2 days. The water stain on the ceiling remained. It would until he repainted, which he wasn't getting to this spring, but it was no longer growing. He stood in the bedroom looking at it and thought, fixed, not erased. That was how most things went. You fixed the cause, you dealt with what remained, you moved forward with the evidence of the past still visible on the ceiling. He was okay with that. Sophie's 8th birthday was in April. He took the day off. He picked her up from school at 3, and she walked out the front doors with the specific energy of someone who has been saving enthusiasm all day for a specific purpose. And she said, before she even reached him, "Is it a real 6 promise or a 9 promise?" He laughed. He hadn't expected it to land as hard as it did, the reference to that other birthday, the one with the purple cake and the yellow dress and the paper turkey on the dashboard that had come later, all of it trailing behind those words like a current. "It's a real 6 promise," he said. "Earlier, actually, it's a 3:15 promise, and we're already there." She looked at him for a moment. That Sophie look, the assessment, the calibration. Then she took his hand and they walked to the truck. He'd made a reservation at a restaurant. A real one, not a chain, the kind with tablecloths and a menu that had more than one page. He'd asked Sophie what she wanted for her birthday, and she'd said, with tremendous seriousness, that she wanted to go somewhere with cloth napkins, because cloth napkins meant it was special. He didn't know where she'd gotten this information. He didn't question it. They had cloth napkins. Sophie unfolded hers and put it in her lap with the deliberate ceremony of someone who has been waiting for this specific experience, and then she looked around the restaurant with the open pleasure of a child who is not trying to be cool about anything, and Liam watched her and thought, this, just this. She ordered pasta. She told the waiter, unprompted, that his recommendation had been very helpful. The waiter, who was maybe 20 and had the slightly overwhelmed quality of someone still learning the job, looked delighted by the interaction. They talked through dinner about school, about Kezia, about a book Sophie was reading where a girl sailed across an ocean alone and navigated by stars, and whether you could still navigate by stars now or whether people just used phones. "You can still navigate by stars," Liam said. "People learn it. It's a real skill." "Can you do it?" "No." "Could you learn?" He thought about it. "Maybe." "We should learn together," she said, with the simplicity of someone for whom this is an obvious and achievable plan. "Okay," he said. She had a chocolate cake for dessert because she'd decided she wanted chocolate this year instead of purple frosting, and the waiter brought it with a single candle and the table nearby sang along unprompted, which was the kind of thing that happened in restaurants and that Sophie found completely wonderful and that Liam found tolerable because she found it wonderful. She blew the candle out on the first try. "What'd you wish for?" he said. "Same as last year." He hadn't known she'd made a wish last year. The birthday with the yellow dress and the cake eaten for breakfast. The candles lit at 9:30 in the morning while he was still bleeding through his gauze. "You didn't tell me what you wished for last year either." "I know." "Does that mean it came true?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about the rules of wishing and has arrived at a considered position. "I'm not telling," she said, "because then it can't come back if I need it again." He didn't push her. He drove home through the spring evening, Sophie asleep in the passenger seat before they reached Calloway Street, her head tipped sideways against the window, the same way it had been on the couch in the yellow dress a year ago. He carried her in. She was getting heavier, the specific heavy of a child who is growing faster than you're tracking, and tucked her in bed with Mr. Flops, and she didn't wake up, not even when he pulled off her shoes. He sat on the porch for a while after. The spring evening was warm enough to be outside without a jacket, barely. The street was quiet. a neighbor walking a dog, the distant sound of someone's back porch conversation 2 houses down, nothing demanding anything from him. He had a beer and he sat with it, and he thought about the year that had passed since Sophie's 7th birthday. He tried to think about it honestly, rather than through the softening lens that time and outcome apply to things, because he believed you owed yourself that, the real accounting, not the edited version. It had been a bad year for a lot of it. He'd done the right things and been punished for them in the standard way, the way the world tends to punish people who do the right things when the wrong things are more convenient for someone with more power. He'd lost 2 jobs in one morning. He'd been broke and scared and running on the particular fuel of a person who cannot afford to stop. He'd spent weeks navigating the distance between what he knew was true and what anyone with the authority to act on it seemed willing to do. None of that had been okay just because it had worked out. He was clear about that. The outcome didn't retroactively justify the process. Raymond Oakes had spent months unemployed through no fault of his own. Hector Diaz had spent 9 months not knowing if the thing he'd done right was going to cost him everything. Carla Menton had decided she didn't want to go back to the place that had made her feel like a problem to be managed, which was entirely understandable, and the settlement she'd received was real money, but it wasn't the same as not having been pushed out in the first place. These were facts. He held them alongside the better facts because the better facts didn't eliminate them. What had changed, what he thought was actually true and not just a story he was telling himself, was the direction of things. The compliance system at Crestline was real now, not a checkbox. The fleet was inspected, documented, maintained by people who kept screenshots when logs were edited. The drivers on Route 11 and Route 7 and 4 and the mountain runs along State Route 9 were driving vehicles that had been looked at by someone who had a reason to look closely and the authority to pull the truck if something was wrong. That was not a small thing. That was the whole thing, really, when you stripped away everything else. He finished the beer and sat with the empty bottle and thought about Isabella. They'd worked together for 4 months now. Not in the same building most days, but in the particular proximity of shared decisions, phone calls, the Thursday check-ins that had become a consistent part of the week's structure. He'd learned how she worked, the legal pad, the complete sentences, the tendency to say difficult things directly and then move past them without dwelling. The way she asked questions that sounded simple but weren't. Not because she was trying to be clever, but because she had a specific mind that moved toward the center of things without necessarily announcing it. They had argued, properly, 4 times. Once about the pace of the fleet repair schedule. She'd wanted faster. He'd insisted that faster meant cutting corners, and that cutting corners was how they'd gotten here, and she'd been quiet for a long moment and then said, "You're right," with the particular quality of someone who was annoyed at being right, but respected the argument. Once about whether to make a public statement about the DOT findings ahead of the press coverage, which she'd thought unnecessary, and he'd thought essential for the contract relationships. And she'd ultimately agreed, though she'd described the resulting statement as aggressively transparent. He'd taken that as a compliment. They'd had lunch twice, once in her kitchen, working through compliance reports at the table with food present because neither of them had eaten, and once at the coffee shop on Milner Avenue where he'd met Dana Rourke, which had seemed like the right place for a conversation that wasn't quite work and wasn't quite something else either. They'd talked about things that weren't Crestline. Her early career, a decade of building something from nothing and the specific loneliness of that, the way ambition costs you things you don't always account for. He'd talked about Claire, Sophie's mother, more than he'd expected to, not because he'd planned to, but because the conversation went somewhere real, and staying on the surface of it would have been false. He'd talked about what it was like to lose someone and still have a reason to get up at 4:47 every morning, and Isabella had listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without reaching for the next thing to say. She'd said, at the end of that lunch, "You're a good person, Liam." He'd been uncomfortable with it, the way he was always uncomfortable with that kind of statement. "I'm a person who tries." "That's what a good person is," she said. "It's not a fixed state. It's the trying." He'd thought about that for a while. He thought about it now, on the porch in the spring evening. He didn't know exactly what the friendship between them was. It didn't fit cleanly into any category he had a word for. It was built on something unusual, the specific bond of a shared night on a mountain road, reinforced by 4 months of working toward the same thing from different angles. They were not the same kind of person. She moved through the world with a fluency he didn't have and probably never would. The ease of resources. The particular confidence of someone who had never had to calculate whether she could afford the right decision. He was aware of the difference. He didn't resent it. It was just a fact, the way most things about people were just facts if you looked at them clearly. But there was something underneath the difference that was the same. The thing she'd called an integrity skill set in the sitting room with the succulent. The thing that made her flag the Truck 14 situation to the DOT before the acquisition closed, even though it complicated the deal. The thing that made him keep a copy of a complaint that nobody had asked him to keep. That thing was the same in both of them. He'd recognized it when she said it. He thought she'd recognized it before she said it. It was a reasonable foundation for something. He didn't need to name it more precisely than that. Not yet. There was time. Summer came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in Tennessee. The days lengthened, the heat settled in, the vehicle bay fans ran all day. The operation found a rhythm, imperfect, still developing, with the occasional friction of a system learning to function the way it was supposed to function. There were difficult days. There were days when Liam looked at a compliance report and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has chosen a hard path and is choosing it again, every morning. He chose it every morning. In June, 6 months into the role, the first unannounced DOT inspection came through. An inspector arrived on a Tuesday without warning, which was the design. The whole point of unannounced inspections was that you couldn't prepare for them, that the condition of the operation on an ordinary Tuesday was what you were actually accountable for. The inspector spent 4 hours going through the vehicle bay. He checked 6 trucks against the current maintenance logs. He reviewed the inspection documentation for the quarter. He talked to 3 drivers. He looked at the route assignment records. He spent an hour with Dominic, who answered every question clearly and pulled every document without hesitation. The inspection found 2 minor documentation errors: timestamps logged in the wrong format on a batch of weekly reports, a procedural issue rather than a substantive one. The inspector noted them, Liam acknowledged them, and the corrective action was completed before the inspector left the facility. The inspector wrote in his summary, "Operation demonstrates substantive improvement in compliance culture. Documentation practices appear genuine and current. Staff engagement with safety protocols indicates systemic rather than cosmetic change." Liam read it standing in the vehicle bay after the inspector had gone. He read it twice. Then he emailed it to Isabella with the subject line, "First unannounced inspection. Attached." Her response came 11 minutes later. 4 words. "Good. Let's keep going." He put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. There was a moment in late July that stayed with him. He was in the vehicle bay with Hector, going through the quarterly brake inspection documentation on the full fleet, which was the kind of task that looked unimpressive from the outside. 2 men with clipboards and a maintenance database, cross-referencing service dates against mileage records. But that was, in the clearest possible sense, the entire point of everything that had happened in the past year. This was the thing that Truck 14 had never had. This was what the falsified timestamps had been replacing. This unglamorous, methodical, necessary work. Hector said without looking up from his clipboard, "You know what the difference is? Between here now and here before?" Liam waited. "Before, I was the only one who knew what I was writing down was true. No one else was checking. No one else cared if the numbers were right or made up." He flipped a page. "Now, you're checking, and I know you're checking. And because I know you're checking, I'd write it down correctly even on a bad day." He looked up. "That's the whole system. Someone's watching, and you know they're watching, and you trust that what you write actually matters." Liam thought about that. "That's it," he said. "Not complicated," Hector said. "No, but somebody has to actually do it." Hector made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. The specific sound of someone who has learned something through the hardest possible means and doesn't need to make a speech about it. "Yeah," he said. "Somebody does." They finished the inspection documentation. Everything cleared. Sophie started 2nd grade in the fall, which she approached with the organizational intensity of someone preparing for a significant expedition. Sharpened pencils arranged by color in her pencil case, new sneakers broken in exactly the right amount before the first day, a list of things she intended to learn that was written in her notebook, and that included, alongside reading and math, navigate by stars and the names of birds. She was going to be fine. She had always been going to be fine, probably. She had her mother's steadiness and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that served a person well. But it was different to see it so clearly, the shape of who she was becoming. He was present for more of it now. That was the thing that mattered most, in the quiet accounting he did on the porch in the evenings. He was home for dinner most nights. He was not running 2 jobs and stretching both of them. He was not calculating which bill to defer. He was not operating at the chronic edge of exhausted that had been his normal for 3 years. He still worked hard. The job was genuinely demanding, the kind of demanding that required real attention and didn't allow shortcuts. But the work was contained within hours he controlled, and what was outside those hours was his. He used it. He took Sophie to see a planetarium show about star navigation, and they both paid attention, and she remembered more of it than he did. He fixed the angle on the gutter, the slightly low section he'd noted in November, which had been bothering him in the abstract for 8 months. He called his mother in Knoxville more often, which he'd been meaning to do and had let slide through the worst of the previous year. He read more, at night after Sophie was asleep, which was something he'd done before Claire and had stopped without noticing when everything else had stopped. The water stain on the bedroom ceiling got repainted in September. He did it himself on a Saturday, with Sophie as his assistant, holding the paint tray and making observations about his technique that were both critical and accurate. The ceiling was not perfect. He'd missed a small section near the light fixture that required a second pass. But when it was done, the stain was gone. What remained was white, slightly uneven in the texture where the old damage had been, but clean. He stood at the door of the bedroom looking at it. Sophie stood beside him, still holding the paint tray, assessing. "Better," she said. "Yeah. You can still kind of tell where it was." "I know. The texture's different." "Does that bother you?" He looked at it for a moment. The place where the damage had been, visible if you knew where to look, invisible if you didn't, repaired, not erased. "No," he said. "Not really." She accepted this. She handed him the paint tray with the particular formality of a job completed. "I'm hungry," she said. "I'll make lunch." "Can we have grilled cheese?" "Yeah." "With tomato soup?" "We've got canned." She weighed this. "Okay," she said, and went to wash the paint off her hands. He stood in the doorway for another moment, alone, looking at the ceiling. He thought about the 1.5 years it had taken to get from one version of his life to this one. He didn't think it in the language of transformation. He was not a person who used that word comfortably. It felt like something borrowed from someone else's story. He thought about it the way he thought about a vehicle repair. This is what was wrong. This is what needed to happen to fix it. This is where you are now and what you're responsible for going forward. What had been wrong was a system that punished honesty and rewarded silence, sustained by the assumption that people who depended on their jobs would stay quiet to protect them. What had happened to fix it was mostly that one person had decided not to stay quiet, and then another person had decided to pay attention to what the first person said, and then a series of hard, unglamorous, necessary things had been done by people who were willing to do them. That was the whole story, really, not a fairy tale, not a clean line from wrong to right. A complicated, imperfect, ongoing process involving real people who made mistakes and got tired and argued about the pace of fleet inspections and sometimes got the fractions wrong on the first try and had to be corrected by 7-year-olds. He went to make the grilled cheese. In October, almost exactly a year after the accident on State Route 9, Isabella called him on a Thursday evening. Not the Thursday check-in, that had already happened, earlier in the afternoon, routine operational matters. This was different. "I was thinking," she said, "about the road." He was in the kitchen, Sophie's homework spread on the table beside him. He knew immediately which road she meant. "Yeah?" "I drove it last week, the same route." He hadn't known she'd done that. "Why?" "I'm not sure exactly. I wanted to see it." A pause. "It's just a road. In the daytime, it's just a road." "Most things are," he said. "There's still a mark in the tree line, where the car went through." He thought about the birch trees, the way they'd looked in the orange light of the burning car. The trees'll fill in, he said. They already are. Another pause, longer. I've been thinking about what you said once, that you didn't plan any of it, that you were just trying to get through the week the right way. I remember. I think about that a lot, the idea that the right thing is just a posture you maintain, not one decision, a posture. Her voice was thoughtful, working something through. I've been in rooms where people make enormous decisions, and the decisions feel clean and significant in the moment, and then afterward the real work is just maintaining a posture every day, doing the inspection, writing the number down correctly, checking the log. That's the whole thing, he said. It was almost word for word what he'd said to Hector in the vehicle bay in July. Yes, a quiet. I wanted to tell you that the way things have gone, with Crestline, with the compliance review, with the contracts, I'm proud of it, what the operation is becoming. I don't say that to the wrong situations either. I know you don't. And I'm glad you were on that road. He sat with that for a moment. The gratitude again, but different this time. Not for the rescue, not for the manila envelope or the compliance reports, for the fact of him being where he was on the night she needed someone to be there. The contingency of it. The way an ordinary Tuesday delivery route had folded two separate lives into each other at a specific point on a mountain road in a rainstorm. I'm glad you were on it too, he said. For the record, a small pause. He could almost hear her processing whether to say what she said next. I'll see you Thursday, she said. Thursday, he said. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Sophie was working on her spelling list, her pencil moving in the careful script of someone who takes the task seriously. Outside, October had turned the trees along Callaway Street into something worth looking at. The particular brief extravagance of Tennessee fall, red and gold against the gray sky, gone in 2 weeks, present now. Dad? Sophie said, without looking up. Yeah. What's the capital of Oregon? Salem. She wrote it down. How do you know that? I just know it. How did you learn it? I don't remember. School, probably. She considered this. I want to know the capital of every state, she said, by next month. That's ambitious. I know. She wrote something else. Will you quiz me? Yeah, he said. I'll quiz you. She returned to her spelling list. The evening light came through the kitchen window at its October angle, long and warm across the table, across her dark hair bent over the worksheet, across his hands resting on the table in front of him. Work-roughened hands, still. They always would be. That was not a complaint. That was just what hands looked like when they'd been used for things that mattered. He thought about everything that had followed from one night on a mountain road. Not tidily. It hadn't been tidy, any of it. 14 employees compensated for wrongful termination, the amount varying by case, the process taking 6 months and more arguments than anyone had anticipated. Truck 14, finally properly repaired in February, cleared by Hector and Dominic both, now running Route 4. The DOT oversight agreement, 9 months into its 12-month run, no additional violations. 2 contract renewals, 1 resignation from the remaining management team that nobody had been sorry to see. Sandra Park promoted to operations director, which she'd accepted with the measured satisfaction of someone who had been doing the job without the title for 2 years and was glad to have the title catch up. Raymond Oakes, who had come back Monday mornings for 9 months now, and driven his routes and come back and reported his vehicle condition honestly and gone home to his family. Carla Menton, who had not come back but who had started something of her own, a small regional dispatching consultancy, according to what Priya had mentioned once, building the things she'd been doing for someone else into something she owned. Hector Diaz, in the vehicle bay on Tuesdays, arguing with Dominic about the right approach to Silverado transmissions with the specific passion of 2 people who both know they're right and are genuinely enjoying proving it. Dana Rourke had published a follow-up article in March, 6 months after the Sterling Capital acquisition, What Changed at Crestline Logistics. It was fair, specific, and more hopeful than the first article without being credulous. She'd called Liam for comment, and he'd given her 2 sentences, which she'd used verbatim. The work is ongoing. The goal is to be the kind of operation that doesn't make headlines for the wrong reasons. He'd meant it. He still meant it. Sophie pushed her spelling list to the side and opened her reading book, the one about the girl sailing the ocean alone. She found her page with the ease of someone who knows exactly where they left off and settled in, and the kitchen went quiet except for the sound of the October evening outside and the slight creak of the house doing what old houses do. He looked at his daughter reading in the kitchen light. He thought about Claire sometimes, more in the evenings, when the light was a certain way. He didn't try to stop it. She was Sophie's mother, and she'd been his person for 6 years. And grief didn't end. It just changed shape, which was something he'd understood intellectually before and understood in his body now. He thought she would have had opinions about all of it, about Crestline, about Isabella, about the ceiling getting repainted. She'd had opinions about everything. It was one of the things he'd loved about her. She wouldn't have been surprised by any of it, probably. She'd always believed he was more than what circumstances had reduced him to at any given moment. He'd been trying to prove her right. He was still trying. That was in the end what all of it came down to. Not the job, not the salary, not the compliance reports, and the fleet inspections and the contract renewals. All of that was real and mattered, and he was genuinely proud of it. But underneath it, the thing that had been true all along, he was a man trying to be the person his daughter could count on. The person who showed up and wrote the thing down and kept the copy and didn't let the pressure of survival make him into something smaller than he wanted to be. He hadn't always succeeded. He'd been tired and scared, and he'd snapped at Sophie over homework twice, and he'd had weeks where the only thing keeping him moving was the sheer mechanical stubbornness of someone who doesn't know another way. He was not a hero of his own story, not in the way that word implies some elevated nature. He was just a person, imperfect and determined, who had tried to get through the week the right way. Every week, again and again. That was all it had ever been, and it had been enough. "Dad?" Sophie said. He looked at her. She had her finger on a word in the book. "What does reckoning mean?" He thought about it. "It means the moment when everything you've done catches up with you," he said, "when you have to face the results of your choices." She considered this. "Is that bad?" "Depends on what choices you made." She looked back at the book. "The girl in the story made good choices," she said. "So hers should be okay." "Yeah," he said. "I think it will be." She returned to reading. He sat at the table in the kitchen light, in the house on Calloway Street, in the life that had been built and broken and rebuilt. Not the same as before, better in some ways and marked in others, honest in the ways that counted. Outside, the October trees held their color for one more evening. Then the wind moved through them, and the leaves let go, and the season turned.